Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore the story of America's first great fortune, the Astor family, and how a butcher's son from a tiny German village became the richest man in the New World. We'll discover how wealth was built in the early days of the American Republic, understand the patient strategies that turned fur pelts and farmland into an empire, and slowly, carefully, trace how one family's fortune shaped New York City and American society for generations. We'll meet John Jacob Astor and walk alongside him from poverty to unimaginable riches, from cobblestone streets in Germany to the forests of the frontier to the glittering ballrooms of Manhattan. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a frantic tale of dramatic risks and sudden fortunes. Instead, we'll move slowly and peacefully through decades of careful building, through the quiet accumulation of land and influence, through the long arc of a family's rise. If you drift away during this story, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let the journey from 18th century Europe to the heights of American wealth carry you gently into sleep. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth, and let's begin our slow drift backward in time, to a small village in Germany, to a world before skyscrapers and stock markets, to the place where the Astor story begins. Let's begin in 1763, in a place most Americans have never heard of and never will, Walldorf. Say the name slowly, Walldorf. A tiny village in what was then the Palatinate region of the Holy Roman Empire, in the southwestern part of what would eventually become Germany. Picture cobblestone streets, narrow and winding, half-timbered houses with their distinctive wooden frames exposed against white plaster walls, the smell of wood smoke and animals and earth. A place where everyone knew everyone, where your father's occupation determined your own, where the world beyond the next village was more rumour than reality. In this village, on a summer day in July of 1763, a boy was born to Johann Jacob Astor and Maria Magdalena Forster. They named him Johann Jakob after his father. We know him as John Jacob Astor, though he wouldn't use that anglicised name for more than 20 years. The family wasn't wealthy. Johann Jakob the father was a butcher, a respectable enough trade, but not one that promised riches or even comfort. There were many children to feed, and while a butcher's family didn't go hungry in the way that landless peasants might, there was never abundance, never luxury, never the sense that the future held anything different from the past. Let yourself imagine what childhood was like in 18th century Walldorf, the rhythm of village life. Unchanging for generations, church bells marking the hours, seasons dictating work, slaughter in autumn, preservation of meat through winter, spring bringing new livestock. Young Johann Jakob would have grown up with the smell of blood and sawdust, would have learned early the value of a coin, the cost of meat, the narrow margins on which a tradesman's family survived. He would have known his station, understood without being told that he was born to be a butcher like his father, or perhaps to learn another trade if he was fortunate and could be apprenticed elsewhere. But here's what's interesting. What set Johann Jakob apart from his brothers and from most boys in his position? He watched his older brothers leave. One by one they departed Walldorf for larger cities, for opportunities elsewhere in Europe and beyond. His brother George went to London. His brother Henry went to New York, a city in the British colonies across an ocean that most people in Walldorf would never see and could barely imagine. These departures planted something in young Johann Jakob's mind. The world was larger than Walldorf. There were places where a butcher's son might become something else, something more. Consider the courage it took in that era to imagine leaving. This wasn't a world of easy travel or communication. If you left your village for a distant city or another country, you might never see your family again. Letters took months if they arrived at all. The journey itself was dangerous. Disease, shipwreck, bandits, countless ways to die between one place and another. And yet his brothers had gone, and they had survived. And occasional letters came back telling of a wider world. By the time Johann Jakob was in his late teens, sometime around 1779 or 1780, he made his decision. He would leave Walldorf, not immediately for America. That leap was too far, too expensive, too uncertain. First, he would follow his brother George to London. It was still a tremendous journey for a teenage boy with almost no money, but it was possible. He could walk much of the way, work when he needed money, make his way across the German states through France to the English Channel, and somehow across to England. The details of this journey are lost to history. We don't know exactly when he left, or what route he took, or how long it took him, but we know he arrived in London, probably around 1780 or 1781. He would have been 16, 17, 18, still a boy really, but carrying himself as a man because he had to. London was enormous compared to Walldorf, a city of perhaps 750,000 people, a centre of global commerce and empire. The noise, the crowds, the Thames River thick with ships, the wealth on display in some quarters and desperate poverty in others. It must have been overwhelming. His brother George had established himself in London making and selling musical instruments, particularly flutes. Johann Jakob joined him in this business, learning the craft, learning English, learning how cities worked and how money moved through them. For a few years he worked alongside his brother. He was good with his hands. A butcher's son learned precision and care with tools. And the musical instrument trade was respectable, skilled work. He might have stayed in London, might have built a modest life there as a craftsman and tradesman, but America called. His brother Henry's letters from New York spoke of opportunity, of a new nation just emerging from revolution against Britain, of land and trade and possibilities that didn't exist in the old, settled hierarchies of Europe. The American Revolution had ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. Britain had recognized American independence. The former colonies were now the United States of America, a new experiment in republican government. And by all accounts, the place was hungry for industrious men willing to work. So Johann Jakob made his decision. He would go to America. He would join his brother Henry in New York. He saved what money he could from his work in London. He booked passage on a ship. And in 1784, at the age of 20 or 21, he boarded a vessel bound across the Atlantic Ocean. Everything he owned fit in a single trunk. He carried 7 flutes made by his brother George, hoping to sell them in America for starting capital. He spoke English with a thick German accent. He had no formal education beyond basic literacy and mathematics. He had no connections in America beyond one brother, but he had something else: ambition, patience, and a willingness to work in ways that others might find beneath them. The Atlantic crossing in 1784 would have taken 6 to 8 weeks under favourable conditions. Longer if storms delayed the ship or winds were contrary. Picture those weeks at sea. The ship would have been crowded with other emigrants, people leaving Europe for countless reasons. Religious freedom, escape from debt, adventure, desperation. The accommodations in steerage would have been cramped, dark, often damp. The food would have been salt pork, hardtack, whatever provisions could survive a long voyage without spoiling. Many passengers became sick from the motion of the ship or from diseases that spread easily in close quarters. But Johann Jakob endured. He spent those weeks thinking, planning, observing his fellow passengers and learning what he could about America from those who had been there before. He practiced his English. He thought about his flutes and how he might sell them. He made himself useful to the crew and other passengers, understanding instinctively that goodwill and connections would matter in his new home. The journey was long and uncomfortable, but it was taking him toward possibility. toward a place where his birth and his father's occupation didn't determine his ceiling. The ship arrived in Baltimore, not New York. Perhaps weather or currents had pushed them south, or perhaps Baltimore was simply the ship's intended destination. Either way, Johann Jakob disembarked in Maryland, not Maryland but America, the United States, the New World. It was late 1784, probably autumn. He was 21 years old. He had his flutes, his trunk, a few coins, and an address for his brother Henry in New York. Baltimore in 1784 was a growing port city of perhaps 13 or 14,000 people. Smaller than London, certainly, but bustling with commerce and construction, and the energy of a young nation finding its footing. Johann Jakob likely didn't stay long. His destination was New York, where his brother waited. But he may have spent a few days or weeks there, getting his bearings, perhaps selling one or two of his flutes to fund the journey north. The trip from Baltimore to New York could be made by ship along the coast, or by a combination of walking and hiring rides with wagons heading north. Again, the details are lost. But by late 1784 or early 1785, Johann Jacob Astor, we can start calling him John Jacob now, as he was beginning to anglicize his name, arrived in New York City. New York in 1785 was still recovering from the Revolutionary War. The British had occupied the city for most of the war, and many buildings had been damaged or destroyed. The population was perhaps 30 to 35,000, concentrated at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Wall Street got its name from an actual wall that had once marked the northern boundary of the Dutch settlement. Above that, Manhattan was largely farmland and woods. The city was small enough that you could walk from one end to the other in less than an hour. John Jacob found his brother Henry, who was working as a butcher, carrying on the family trade in the New World. For a brief time, John Jacob may have helped him, but he hadn't crossed the ocean to be a butcher in America when he could have been a butcher in Germany. He had his flutes, and he began making the rounds of merchants and music teachers and anyone who might want to buy a well-crafted instrument. He was persistent, polite, willing to negotiate. He sold the flutes one by one for prices that gave him a small profit above what his brother George had charged him. And then something happened that would change everything. In his dealings with merchants and in conversations in taverns and boarding houses, John Jacob began hearing about the fur trade. Beaver pelts, particularly, were extraordinarily valuable. In Europe, beaver fur was used to make felt for hats, tall, fashionable hats that every gentleman of means wanted to own. The best beaver pelts came from North America, where beavers were still plentiful, unlike in Europe, where they had been hunted nearly to extinction. Trappers and traders would venture into the frontier, the forests of upstate New York, the territory around the Great Lakes, deeper into the continent, and trade with Native Americans for furs. These furs would then be shipped to New York, and from New York to London and other European cities, where they commanded extraordinary prices. John Jacob began asking questions. How did the trade work? Who were the trappers? How did you acquire furs? What did they cost here? And what did they sell for in Europe? Who controlled the trade routes? He learned that much of the trade was conducted through a small number of established merchants and trading companies. He learned that Native Americans did most of the actual trapping, trading the furs for goods like metal tools, cloth, guns, whiskey. He learned that the margins could be enormous if you knew what you were doing. A pelt that cost a few dollars in trade goods might sell for 10 or 20 times that in London. This was his moment of recognition. Not a dramatic revelation, not a sudden flash of insight, but a slow understanding that built over weeks and months of observation and conversation. The fur trade was the opportunity he had been searching for. It required relatively little capital to start. You could buy a few pelts, sell them for profit, and use that profit to buy more. It required knowledge and relationships more than money. It required a willingness to work directly with trappers and Native Americans, which many established merchants found distasteful or beneath them. And crucially, it required someone who understood both the American supply side and the European demand side, someone who could navigate between two worlds. John Jacob Astor was uniquely positioned. He had come from Europe and understood European markets and tastes. He was now in America and was willing to learn the American side. He had no social status to protect, no reputation that might be tarnished by dealing in furs and consorting with trappers. He was young and strong and could travel to meet trappers in frontier towns and villages. He spoke German, which was useful because many trappers and frontier traders were German immigrants. His English was improving daily. He was, in short, perfectly suited to become a fur trader, even though he knew almost nothing about furs when he arrived. So he educated himself. He bought a few pelts, studied them, learned to judge quality, the thickness and texture of the fur, the size and condition of the skin, the difference between beaver and otter and fox. He began making trips up the Hudson River to Albany and beyond, to the frontier settlements where trappers came to sell their catches. He observed how negotiations worked, how prices were set, what the trappers wanted in exchange. He was methodical, patient, absorbing everything he could learn. And in 1785, a year after arriving in America, John Jacob Astor made a decision that would prove pivotal. He married Sarah Todd, the daughter of his landlady. Sarah was a widow's daughter, and while her family wasn't wealthy, she had a small inheritance, perhaps a few $100s. Accounts vary. But more important than the money was Sarah herself. She was intelligent, practical, good with numbers, and she understood business. From the beginning, the marriage was a partnership. Sarah would manage much of the business side while John Jacob travelled to acquire furs. She kept the books, managed inventory, dealt with customers, and advised on strategy. This wasn't a wife decoratively supporting her husband's work. This was a business partner who happened to be his spouse. If you're feeling sleepy now, that's wonderful. Let the image of young John Jacob and Sarah, just beginning their partnership, settling into your mind. Picture them in a small room in Lower Manhattan, counting coins and examining fur pelts by candlelight, planning their future together with hope and careful calculation. Let that gentle scene carry you deeper into rest. There's no need to hold on to every detail. Just let the story wash over you like waves on a shore, each one taking you a little further from the day and closer to sleep. We have so much more to explore, but it will all be there whenever you return. For now, just breathe and let yourself drift. The fur trade in the late 1780s and early 1790s was a complex network of relationships, geography, and commerce that stretched from the deepest wilderness of North America to the fashionable streets of London and Paris. To understand how John Jacob Astor built his fortune, we need to understand how this trade actually worked, the rhythm and flow of it, the patient accumulation of knowledge and connections that turned animal pelts into wealth. Let's start with the beaver itself. Picture the animal, thick-bodied, industrious, building its dams in cold northern streams and rivers. The beaver's fur had a unique quality that made it extraordinarily valuable for hat-making. Each hair had tiny barbs that would interlock when the fur was processed into felt, creating a material that was dense, water-resistant, and could be shaped into hats that held their form beautifully. A good beaver hat was a mark of status and taste in European society, and the demand seemed limitless. Gentleman after gentleman wanted these hats, and European beavers had been hunted nearly to extinction, making North American pelts essential. The trade began in the wilderness. Native American trappers, particularly from tribes in the Great Lakes region and the northern forests, knew the waterways and the habits of the animals. They set their traps along streams and rivers, checking them through the harsh winter months when beaver fur was thickest and most valuable. This was difficult, dangerous work, walking through snow, breaking ice to set traps, spending days or weeks away from villages in temperatures that could kill an unprepared person. The trappers accumulated pelts through the winter, and when spring came and rivers thawed, They would travel to trading posts or to settlements where they could exchange their furs. What did they want in return? Metal goods primarily, knives, axes, cooking pots, needles, things made of iron and steel that were difficult or impossible for them to produce themselves. They wanted wool blankets, which were warmer and more durable than traditional hides. They wanted guns and ammunition for hunting, and yes, they wanted alcohol, whiskey primarily, which became a destructive but common element of the trade. The exchange rates were set largely by the European traders, and they were rarely fair by any objective measure. A pelt that might be worth $20 or $30 in New York might be traded for goods that cost the trader $3 or $4. This is where John Jacob Astor saw his opportunity. Most established fur traders operated through a chain of middlemen. A trapper would sell to a local trading post operator. That operator would sell to a regional merchant. The regional merchant would sell to a New York exporter. The New York exporter would ship to London. At each step, someone took a profit, and by the time a pelt reached its final market, it had passed through 4 or 5 hands, each one taking their share. Astor's insight was simple but powerful. Eliminate as many of those middlemen as possible. If he could buy directly from trappers, or as close to them as possible, and then ship directly to European markets where he had connections from his time in London, he could capture most of that profit margin himself. It would require him to travel to the frontier personally. It would require him to develop relationships with Native American trappers who might not trust a young German immigrant. It would require capital to buy inventory and hold it until it could be shipped. But it was possible, and the rewards could be enormous, so Astor began travelling. In the late 1780s and early 1790s, he made regular trips up the Hudson River to Albany and beyond, into the Mohawk Valley, to small settlements on the edge of the frontier. He would announce his arrival and wait for trappers to bring their pelts. He examined each one carefully, learning to judge quality with increasing expertise. He negotiated in a straightforward way, offering fair prices by the standards of the time. Not generous, but fair enough that trappers would return to him in future seasons, rather than seeking other buyers. He learned to speak a bit of several native languages, enough to conduct basic negotiations. He learned which tribes produced the highest quality furs and which regions had the best beaver populations. He learned the seasonal rhythms, when to travel to acquire furs, when to ship them to Europe to catch the right markets, when to hold inventory if prices were temporarily low. This knowledge was hard-won, built up through countless conversations and observations and occasionally through expensive mistakes. Sarah, meanwhile, was managing the New York end of the business. When John Jacob returned from his trips with wagons full of pelts, she oversaw the sorting and grading, the packing for shipment, the negotiation with ship captains for cargo space. She kept meticulous records of what was bought, what was sold, what profits were made, what costs were incurred. She dealt with the merchants and traders in New York who wanted to buy some of Astor's inventory before it went to Europe. Her head for numbers and her practical judgment were as important to the business as her husband's knowledge of furs and willingness to travel. The marriage dowry Sarah had brought, those few $100s, had been the crucial starting capital. But within a few years, through careful reinvestment of every profit, the business had grown well beyond that initial stake. By the early 1790s, Astor was making several $1,000s per year, a comfortable income that would have satisfied most men. But he wasn't most men. He reinvested almost everything, buying more pelts, expanding his territory, building his knowledge and his network. Consider the patience this required. Astor couldn't just snap his fingers and become a successful fur trader. Each trip to the frontier took weeks or months. Furs bought in spring might not be sold until autumn, or even the following year. Payments from European buyers took months to arrive. If they arrived at all, ships sometimes sank, merchants sometimes went bankrupt or simply refused to pay. Cash flow was uncertain and irregular. There were seasons when Astor was, on paper, quite wealthy in inventory, but had almost no actual money to pay for food or rent. It required trust between husband and wife, a shared commitment to long-term building rather than immediate comfort. And then, in 1795, something happened that would dramatically expand Astor's opportunities. The Jay Treaty was signed between the United States and Great Britain. Among its many provisions, the treaty opened up trading rights in Canadian territory to American merchants. Previously, much of the most productive fur territory, the lands north of the Great Lakes, the vast forests of what is now Ontario and Quebec, had been restricted to British traders. Now American merchants like Astor could compete for those furs. This was enormous. Canadian territory had some of the best beaver populations remaining in North America. The native tribes there had long established trading relationships. And the quality of pelts from the cold northern regions was exceptional. Astor immediately began expanding his operations northward. He established relationships with trappers and traders in Montreal, which was the centre of the Canadian fur trade. He began making the long journey to Montreal regularly, negotiating for furs that he would then ship through New York to Europe. The competition was fierce. The Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company were well-established British trading firms with decades of experience and extensive networks. They didn't welcome this ambitious American upstart. But Astor had advantages. He could offer competitive prices because he was eliminating middlemen. He was personally reliable. Trappers learned that if Astor said he would be at a certain place on a certain date with goods to trade, he would be there. And he was willing to work harder and travel farther than many of his competitors. While established traders sent agents, Astor often went himself, building personal relationships that translated into business loyalty. By the late 1790s, Astor's business was substantial. He was one of the leading fur traders in New York, handling thousands of pelts per year, making tens of thousands of dollars in revenue with profit margins that were sometimes as high as 50% on successful transactions. He and Sarah lived comfortably now, though not lavishly. They had a proper house rather than rented rooms. They employed servants. They were rising in New York's commercial class, no longer struggling immigrants but established merchants. But Astor was already thinking beyond the fur trade as it existed. He had a vision of something larger, something more ambitious. He understood that the real profits in the fur trade came from controlling the entire chain, from the trapping to the final sale in Europe, and he understood that the fur trade was intimately connected with another enormously profitable trade route, the China trade. Here's how the China trade worked, and why it mattered to the fur business. Chinese merchants had an insatiable appetite for sea otter pelts, which were found along the Pacific coast of North America. These pelts were even more valuable than beaver in Chinese markets. European and American traders would buy sea otter pelts from native tribes in the Pacific Northwest, sail across the Pacific to Canton, the only Chinese port open to foreign trade, and exchange the furs for Chinese goods like tea, silk, and porcelain. These Chinese goods were then sailed to Europe or the American East Coast and sold at enormous profit. Astor didn't yet have the capital to mount expeditions to the Pacific coast himself, but he began investing in other merchants' voyages, taking shares in the cargoes of ships heading to Canton. He learned about the China trade, about the protocols and customs of dealing with Chinese merchants, about the goods that commanded the best prices. This knowledge would prove crucial in the next phase of his business expansion. In 1803, something happened that would transform the entire landscape of American commerce and give Astor an opportunity he could never have imagined. The Louisiana Purchase. President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France, a vast expanse of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, doubling the size of the United States. The price was $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre, one of history's great real estate bargains. The Louisiana Purchase opened the entire western half of the continent to American expansion and commerce. The fur resources in this territory were largely unexploited. The Missouri River and its tributaries ran through some of the finest beaver country in North America. Lewis and Clark's expedition, commissioned by Jefferson to explore this new territory, returned in 1806 with reports of abundant wildlife and native tribes eager to trade. The race was on to establish trading networks in this vast new region. Astor moved quickly. In 1808, he established the American Fur Company, capitalizing it with an initial investment of several $100,000, nearly all of his accumulated wealth from 15 years of trading. This was an enormous risk. If the venture failed, he would lose everything he had built. But he believed the potential rewards justified the risk, and his track record of careful judgment suggested his confidence was well-founded. The American Fur Company was designed to operate on a scale far beyond anything Astor had done before. He would establish trading posts throughout the Great Lakes region and eventually push westward along the Missouri River and beyond. He would employ hundreds of trappers and traders. He would have his own ships to transport furs. He would control every aspect of the business, from the initial trade with the native trappers to the final sale in European and Asian markets. It was vertical integration on a grand scale, and it was modelled on the successful strategies of the great British trading companies but adapted to American circumstances. The first few years of the American Fur Company were spent establishing infrastructure. Trading posts had to be built, often in remote locations where construction materials had to be transported hundreds of miles. Relationships with native tribes had to be negotiated, trading protocols established, territorial boundaries respected. Trappers and traders had to be recruited and trained. Supply chains had to be created to deliver the goods that would be traded for furs, metal tools, blankets, guns, all of which had to be manufactured in the east and transported west. This was expensive and complex work. Astor spent money faster than it came in during these initial years, something that would have terrified most merchants, but which he accepted as the necessary cost of building something large and enduring. Sarah, as always, managed the financial side with careful attention, ensuring that debts were paid and credit was maintained, that the company remained solvent even as it expanded aggressively. And then Astor had an even more audacious idea. He would establish a trading post at the mouth of the Columbia River on the Pacific coast. This post would allow him to acquire sea otter pelts directly from Pacific Northwest tribes, eliminating his dependence on other merchants. It would give the American Fur Company a presence on both coasts of the continent, and it would be a base for direct trade with China, allowing Astor to capture the profits from the entire Pacific trade route. In 1811, he dispatched 2 expeditions to establish what would be called Astoria. One group sailed around South America and up the Pacific coast, a voyage of many months that would take them through some of the world's most treacherous waters. Another group travelled overland from St. Louis, following much of the route Lewis and Clark had pioneered, crossing the Rocky Mountains and eventually reaching the Pacific. Both journeys were incredibly difficult. Men died from disease, accidents, hostile encounters. But both expeditions eventually reached the Columbia River mouth and began constructing Fort Astoria. It was a remarkable achievement, a trading post on the Pacific established by an immigrant who had arrived in America less than 30 years earlier with nothing but a trunk and 7 flutes. Fort Astoria represented Astor's vision at its most ambitious: control of the fur trade from coast to coast, direct access to Asian markets, a commercial empire that spanned oceans and continents. But let's pause here for a moment. Take a slow breath. We've travelled from John Jacob's arrival in New York through 2.5 decades of patient building, careful strategy, and expanding ambition. Picture the span of it. From carrying pelts on his back through the Mohawk Valley to commanding ships sailing to China and expeditions crossing the continent. The transformation is remarkable, but it happened gradually, year by year, decision by decision, each one building on the last. If you're feeling sleepy, let yourself drift. The image of Fort Astoria, perched at the edge of the Pacific with the wilderness stretching endlessly behind it, can be a peaceful place to rest your thoughts. The rhythm of waves against the shore, the tall trees swaying in the wind, the sense of something being built at the very edge of the known world. Let that carry you deeper into rest. The fur trade required an understanding not just of economics, but of human nature, of cross-cultural negotiation, of the natural world. Astor excelled at all of it. He understood that Native American trappers responded to fair dealing and reliability, that European merchants valued quality and consistent supply, that Chinese traders had their own protocols and preferences. He adapted to each, learning what he needed to learn, showing respect where it was warranted, driving hard bargains when he could, but never cheating in ways that would destroy long-term relationships. He also understood something crucial about commodities trading that many of his competitors missed. The value of a fur pelt fluctuated based on supply and demand, on fashion trends in Europe, on economic conditions in distant markets. Astor became skilled at anticipating these fluctuations. When prices were high, he sold aggressively, sometimes depleting his entire inventory. When prices were low, he held pelts in storage, waiting for markets to recover. This required capital to weather the lean times, and it required nerve to resist the temptation to sell at bad prices just to generate cash flow. But it dramatically increased his overall profitability compared to traders who simply sold whatever they had whenever they could. Sarah's role in all of this cannot be overstated. She was not merely keeping books or managing a warehouse. She was making strategic decisions about when to sell and when to hold inventory. She was negotiating with ship captains and merchants in New York, while John Jacob was travelling for months at a time. She was raising their children. They would eventually have 8, though several died in childhood, as was tragically common in that era. She was managing the household, managing the business, and serving as her husband's closest advisor on all matters of strategy and finance. The Astor fortune was built by 2 people, not one, even though history tends to remember only John Jacob's name. By 1810, the American Fur Company was well established and growing. Astor was shipping tens of thousands of pelts per year. His wealth was accumulating rapidly. He was almost certainly a millionaire by this point, though exact figures are difficult to determine. He had competitors, certainly. Other traders and companies were active in the fur business, and some of them were formidable. But Astor had advantages they couldn't match. He had the most extensive network of trading posts. He had the deepest knowledge of both American supply and international demand. He had the capital to invest in expansion, while others were constrained by limited resources. And he had the patience to build for the long term, rather than extracting maximum short-term profit. The structure he had built was remarkable. From trading posts scattered across the frontier, pelts would be collected and transported to central warehouses in New York. There they would be graded, packed and loaded onto ships bound for London, Hamburg or Canton. In those distant cities, Astor had agents who would sell the furs to manufacturers and merchants, collecting payments and sending them back to New York. The circle was complete. Goods flowed out from New York to trading posts. Furs flowed back to New York, money flowed in from European and Asian markets, and a portion of that money was reinvested in more goods to trade, more ships, more trading posts, in a constantly expanding cycle. The profits from this system were substantial but not instantaneous. The entire cycle from initial trade with a trapper to final payment from a European buyer could take a year or more. Astor was constantly managing risk. The risk of ships sinking, of furs rotting in storage, of markets collapsing, of conflicts with native tribes disrupting trade, of competitors undercutting his prices. But he managed these risks skillfully, never betting everything on a single venture, always maintaining enough diversification that a single disaster couldn't destroy him. He also reinvested his profits not just in more fur trading, but in other ventures. He bought shares in ships, earning income from cargo that had nothing to do with furs. He began making small investments in New York real estate, buying lots and buildings that seemed likely to appreciate as the city grew. He lent money at interest to other merchants who needed capital. He was, in short, becoming not just a fur trader, but a capitalist in the broader sense, someone who deployed capital across multiple ventures to generate returns. The fur trade remained his primary business and the source of most of his wealth. But he was already beginning to diversify. Let yourself rest for a moment with this image. Astor in his counting house in New York, surrounded by ledgers and letters and maps, making decisions that would ripple across the continent and across oceans. Sarah nearby, reviewing accounts, offering her judgment on some question of timing or pricing. The patient, methodical accumulation of wealth through knowledge and judgment and tireless work. There's something almost meditative about it. The slow building of a fortune through attention to detail and long-term thinking. The American Fur Company in these years was not yet the dominant force in the trade. That would come later. But it was growing steadily, establishing itself as a major player and positioning Astor to capitalize on the opportunities that would come as the American frontier pushed westward. The foundation was being laid, carefully and thoroughly, for what would eventually become one of the great American fortunes. And all of it had started with a willingness to examine beaver pelts and travel into the wilderness to meet trappers, work that established merchants found beneath their dignity, but which Astor embraced as the path to wealth. The world that John Jacob Astor had carefully constructed, with its trading posts and shipping routes and relationships built over decades, was about to be severely tested. In June of 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. The causes were complex: British interference with American shipping, the impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, disputes over territorial boundaries, the desire of some Americans to expand into British-held Canada. But whatever the causes, the effect on Astor's business was immediate and catastrophic. The War of 1812 disrupted Atlantic trade almost completely. British warships patrolled the coast, seizing American merchant vessels. Insurance rates for shipping became prohibitively expensive, if insurance could be obtained at all. The safe, predictable flow of furs from New York to London that Astor had relied upon simply stopped. His warehouses filled with pelts that couldn't be shipped, representing enormous capital tied up in inventory that was generating no return and was actually depreciating as the furs aged. Even worse, his most ambitious venture, Fort Astoria on the Pacific coast, was now extremely vulnerable. The fort was isolated, thousands of miles from any American military support, and the British Navy controlled the Pacific approaches. In 1813, facing the prospect of British seizure of the fort and all its valuable inventory, Astor's men on the ground made a painful decision. They sold Fort Astoria to the Northwest Company, a British fur trading concern, for a fraction of what Astor had invested in establishing it. The news took months to reach New York, and when it did, Astor was devastated. Years of planning, enormous expense. The lives of men who had died on the expeditions to establish the fort, all of it lost. Let yourself sit with this reversal for a moment. Imagine how it must have felt for a man who had built everything through careful planning and patient accumulation, to see years of work undone by forces completely beyond his control. The war wasn't his fault. The vulnerability of Fort Astoria was perhaps a calculated risk that simply didn't work out. But the loss was real and substantial regardless of who was to blame. But here's where Astor's character revealed itself most clearly. He didn't despair. He didn't become paralyzed by the setback. Instead, he looked at the new situation and asked himself a question that would define the rest of his business career. If normal trade is disrupted, what opportunities does the disruption create? War closes some doors, yes, but it also opens others. The challenge was to identify the opportunities and move quickly before others did. One opportunity was obvious. The American military needed supplies, uniforms, food, weapons, transportation. The government had money to spend and an urgent need for goods and services. Astor had ships sitting idle because Atlantic trade was too dangerous. He had warehouses and commercial connections. He could pivot from international trade to government contracting, at least temporarily, using the same infrastructure for a different purpose. So he began bidding on government contracts. He supplied food to military posts. He transported troops and materials along the coast, taking advantage of brief periods when shipping was relatively safe or when military escorts were available. He sold goods from his warehouses to the military at prices that were high, but not quite high enough to be considered profiteering. The government was desperate and not particularly price-sensitive, and Astor was reliable and could deliver what he promised when he promised it, which many contractors could not. This work wasn't as profitable per transaction as the fur trade had been in good times, but it generated steady cash flow and kept his business operations active during years when they might otherwise have been dormant. More importantly, it established relationships with government officials and military officers, relationships that would prove valuable in the decades to come. Astor was always thinking several moves ahead, always considering how current actions might create future opportunities. But there was another, more controversial aspect of Astor's activities during the war years, something that requires us to think carefully about business ethics and the grey areas between legitimate trade and illegal activity. Astor engaged in what we might politely call grey market commerce, and what others might simply call smuggling. The war made certain goods scarce and therefore extremely valuable. British goods couldn't legally be imported into the United States, and American goods couldn't legally be exported to British territories. But laws and reality don't always align perfectly, especially during wartime when enforcement is inconsistent and borders are porous. There were ways to move goods through neutral countries, through corrupt customs officials, through ships that claimed to be travelling to neutral ports but actually went elsewhere. The profits from such trade could be enormous because the risks and scarcity drove prices up dramatically. Did Astor engage in this kind of trade? Almost certainly. The historical evidence is murky. People engaged in legally questionable activities rarely documented them clearly, but various accounts and investigations suggest that Astor found ways to continue some international trade despite the war. He used his ships to carry goods to and from Canada, claiming they were bound for neutral ports. He may have bribed customs officials or military officers to look the other way. He exploited loopholes in trade restrictions and obtained special licenses that allowed some commerce to continue. We should be careful not to judge this too harshly by modern standards. Wartime trade restrictions were widely considered unjust by merchants, who argued that they had nothing to do with the political disputes that caused wars and shouldn't have their livelihoods destroyed by them. Smuggling was common and somewhat socially acceptable, seen more as clever business than serious crime. And Astor wasn't aiding the enemy militarily. He was simply moving furs and trade goods, not weapons or strategic materials. But we should also be honest that this was illegal activity that enriched Astor while the nation was at war. He was profiting from the very conflict that had destroyed his Fort Astoria investment. The moral complexity here is real. He was a businessman protecting his interests and those of his family. He was also subverting laws enacted by a democratic government for what it considered national security purposes. Both things can be true simultaneously. The war years were difficult for most Americans. Trade was disrupted. Prices for many goods rose sharply. The economy contracted. Young men died in battles and from disease in military camps. But Astor emerged from the war years in reasonably good financial shape. He had lost money on Fort Astoria, yes, but he had made money from government contracts and grey market trade. More importantly, he had preserved his commercial infrastructure, his ships, his warehouses, his network of connections, through years when many other merchants had gone bankrupt. The war ended with the Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve of 1814. News travelled slowly, and the most famous battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans, was actually fought in January of 1815, weeks after the peace treaty was signed, but before anyone in New Orleans knew the war was over. By spring of 1815, though, peace was established and trade was beginning to normalise. Astor moved quickly to capitalise on the post-war environment. He re-established his European trading connections, shipping the furs that had accumulated in his warehouses during the war years. Prices for furs were high because supply had been disrupted for nearly 3 years, so the pelts he had been forced to hold were now worth more than they would have been if he had sold them before the war. This was partly luck and partly Astor's refusal to dump inventory at depressed prices during the war. He had held on, absorbing the carrying costs, betting that peace would eventually come and prices would recover. It was a calculated risk that paid off handsomely. The American Fur Company, which had struggled during the war years, now expanded aggressively. The frontier was pushing westward, new territories were opening to American trade, and Astor was positioned to dominate the fur business in ways he hadn't been before the war. Many of his competitors had failed during the conflict, or emerged from it financially weakened. Astor, by contrast, had preserved and even strengthened his position, and he now had the field largely to himself in many regions. He established new trading posts throughout the Great Lakes region and along the upper Mississippi River. He negotiated agreements with Native American tribes, offering better prices than other traders and guaranteeing reliable annual visits to their territories. He hired experienced trappers and traders, paying them well and providing them with the best equipment and supplies. The American Fur Company became the dominant force in the North American fur trade, controlling perhaps 3/4 of the business by the early 1820s. But Astor was also beginning to think beyond the fur trade. He had seen how vulnerable the business was to disruption from war, from changing fashion trends, from the depletion of beaver populations. The fur business had made him wealthy, but he didn't want to be dependent on it forever. He began to consider what other investments might provide more stable, long-term returns. And this is where his attention turned increasingly to real estate, specifically to Manhattan real estate, though we'll explore that shift more deeply in a bit. Before we move on from the war years, though, let's consider the China trade connection, because this became increasingly important to Astor in the post-war period. Chinese merchants, as we mentioned earlier, prized sea otter pelts from the Pacific Northwest. But the China trade was about more than just furs. American ships would sail to Canton carrying not just furs but also sandalwood from Hawaii, seal skins from the southern Pacific, ginseng from the American forests, various products that Chinese merchants wanted. In return, they would load up with tea, silk, porcelain and other Chinese goods that commanded high prices in America and Europe. Astor couldn't establish a post on the Pacific coast after losing Fort Astoria, but he could invest in other merchants' voyages to Canton. He became a major investor in the China trade, often taking large shares in cargo or even financing entire voyages. The returns could be spectacular. A successful round trip to Canton might double or triple the initial investment. Of course, the risks were also substantial. Ships could sink in storms, crews could die of disease. Chinese officials could confiscate cargo for various infractions of the complex trading protocols. But Astor understood risk management. He never put all his capital in a single voyage. He spread his investments across multiple ships, sailing at different times, so that the loss of one vessel wouldn't destroy him. The mechanics of the China trade were fascinating and complex. Canton was the only Chinese port officially open to foreign trade, and foreigners were confined to a small district called the factories, where they lived and conducted business under strict Chinese supervision. Trade could only be conducted through a small group of licensed Chinese merchants called the Kohong. These merchants had a monopoly on foreign trade and could set prices and terms largely as they pleased. Dealing with them required patience, cultural sensitivity, and a willingness to navigate a system very different from American or European commercial practices. Astor never went to China himself. By this point in his life, he was in his 50s and not inclined to undertake voyages that could take a year or more. But he employed agents who understood the China trade, and he studied reports from every voyage carefully, learning what sold well, what the Chinese merchants wanted, what mistakes to avoid. He built relationships with the Kohong merchants through his agents, establishing trust and credit that allowed him to conduct larger and more profitable transactions. The circular trade routes that developed were elegant in their efficiency. An Astor financed ship might leave New York with manufactured goods and sail to the Pacific Northwest. There it would trade the goods for sea otter pelts from Native American tribes. Then it would sail across the Pacific to Hawaii, picking up sandalwood. From Hawaii it would continue to Canton, where the furs and sandalwood would be sold for silver and Chinese goods. The ship would then sail to Europe, sell the Chinese goods, and use the proceeds to buy European manufactured goods. Finally, it would return to New York with those goods, completing a voyage that had circled much of the globe and touched 4 continents. Each leg of such a journey produced profits, and the cumulative return on a successful voyage could be enormous. Of course, the voyage also took 18 months to 2 years to complete, meaning capital was tied up for long periods. And the risks multiplied with each leg. The more times a ship had to navigate dangerous waters or negotiate in foreign ports, the more opportunities for disaster. But Astor was comfortable with these calculations. The returns justified the risks, and his diversified approach meant he could absorb losses from failed voyages while still profiting overall. If you're feeling sleepy now, let the image of these ships sailing across vast oceans carry you deeper into rest. Picture a vessel under sail in the Pacific, weeks from any land, the crew working according to rhythms unchanged for centuries, the cargo hold filled with furs and exotic goods, slowly making its way toward distant markets. The patient voyage, month after month, the eventual arrival and profitable sale. There's something peaceful in imagining these long, slow journeys. The way wealth was built through time and distance and the methodical execution of plans laid months or years earlier. By the early 1820s, Astor's business empire was vast and complex. The American Fur Company was the dominant force in North American fur trading. His investments in the China trade were substantial and profitable. His ships carried cargo all over the world. His warehouses in New York were among the largest in the city. He employed hundreds of people directly and thousands indirectly through the various trappers and traders who depended on his business. He was one of the wealthiest men in America, with a fortune estimated at perhaps $1 or $2 million. Extraordinary wealth in an era when a skilled craftsman might earn $300 per year. But Astor was also beginning to see that the fur trade, which had made his fortune, was approaching its peak. Beaver populations were declining from decades of intensive trapping. Fashion trends in Europe were shifting. Silk hats were beginning to replace beaver felt hats in popularity. New competition was emerging as more traders entered the business, attracted by the profits that men like Astor were making. The American Fur Company would remain profitable for years to come, but Astor sensed that the extraordinary growth was behind it, that the future would be about managing a mature business rather than building an expanding empire. This realization led him to start thinking seriously about his exit strategy from the fur business and his entry into what would become the real foundation of the Astor fortune, Manhattan real estate. But that transition didn't happen all at once. Through the 1820s, he continued to operate the American Fur Company actively, continued to invest in the China trade, continued to expand his commercial operations. The shift to real estate was gradual, a slow reallocation of capital from trading businesses to property ownership, from active commerce to passive rental income. It was characteristic of Astor's approach. Nothing sudden or dramatic, but a patient, strategic evolution from one business model to another as circumstances and opportunities changed. The war years had taught him important lessons. They taught him that even the best planned ventures could be destroyed by forces beyond his control. They taught him that diversification was essential. Having all his wealth in the fur trade had made him vulnerable to trade disruptions. They taught him that opportunities existed even in crisis, for those who were prepared to recognize and act on them. And they taught him that wealth needed to be converted eventually from risky active businesses into more stable, secure forms if it was to endure across generations. These lessons would guide his thinking as he entered the next phase of his career, the phase that would ultimately make the Astor name synonymous with real estate wealth and establish a fortune that would last for generations. But for now, in the early 1820s, he was still primarily a fur trader and merchant. Still personally involved in the day-to-day operations of his businesses, still the same man who had arrived in Baltimore 40 years earlier with 7 flutes and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. He had succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined when he left Walldorf, but he wasn't finished yet. The most important decisions of his business career were still ahead of him. While John Jacob Astor was still deeply engaged in the fur trade through the 1820s, his attention was increasingly drawn to something that would ultimately prove far more valuable and enduring than beaver pelts or China trade profits. He was watching Manhattan Island transform, and he understood with remarkable clarity that he was witnessing the early stages of one of history's great urban expansions. The question wasn't whether New York would grow, that seemed certain. The question was how to position himself to profit from that growth in the most effective way possible. Let's picture Manhattan as it existed in the early 1800s, because the transformation that occurred over the following decades is almost difficult to believe. In 1800, New York City's population was perhaps 60,000 people, concentrated almost entirely at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Wall Street marked roughly the northern boundary of dense settlement. Beyond that, there were scattered farms, country estates, woods, marshes, rocky outcroppings. If you stood at what is now Times Square in 1800, you would have been in the countryside surrounded by farmland and forest, with the nearest substantial buildings perhaps 2 miles to the south. The island was about 13 miles long and roughly 2 miles wide at its widest point. The terrain was varied. Rolling hills, rocky ridges, streams, ponds, wetlands. Much of it was difficult to develop with the technology of the time, but Astor looked at this undeveloped land and saw something that most of his contemporaries didn't see, or saw but didn't act upon with anything like his conviction. He saw that as the city grew, and it would grow, it had to grow because commerce and immigration were both increasing, this farmland would become city blocks. These woods would become streets and buildings. This rocky countryside would become some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. The insight itself wasn't entirely original. Others recognized that Manhattan would grow. But Astor acted on this recognition with a commitment and patience that set him apart. Beginning in the early 1800s and continuing through the 1820s and 30s, he began systematically buying Manhattan real estate, particularly in areas that were still undeveloped, but that lay in the path of the city's northward expansion. His strategy was beautifully simple. He would buy land when it was cheap, when it was still farmland or woods, valued for agricultural use rather than urban development. He would hold it, sometimes for decades, paying minimal taxes because undeveloped land was taxed lightly. He would wait for the city to grow northward until his land was no longer on the outskirts, but in the middle of developed areas, and then, crucially, he would not sell. Instead, he would lease the land on very long-term ground leases, retaining ownership while collecting rent from whoever wanted to build on his property. Let me explain how these ground leases worked, because they were the key to the Astor fortune's durability. Imagine you want to build a house or a shop in Manhattan. You find a piece of land owned by John Jacob Astor. He will not sell you the land. Instead, he will lease it to you for 99 years, or in some cases for even longer. You pay him an annual ground rent, perhaps a few $100s per year for a residential lot. More for commercial property. You can build whatever you want on the land. You own the building, but Astor owns the land beneath it. During the lease term, you pay the ground rent every year without fail. At the end of 99 years, the lease expires and everything reverts to Astor or his heirs, the land and whatever buildings stand on it. From a tenant's perspective, a 99-year lease was effectively the same as ownership. 99 years was longer than any individual's lifetime. You could build, modify, even sell your leasehold interest to someone else, passing the obligation to pay ground rent to the buyer. For most practical purposes, you controlled the property as if you owned it. But from Astor's perspective, the ground lease structure was brilliant. He got steady, predictable income from the annual rents. He didn't have to manage buildings or deal with repairs or tenant complaints. That was the leaseholder's responsibility. The ground rent payments gave him cash flow that could be used to buy more land. And at the end of the lease term, he or his heirs would own not just the land, but also whatever improvements had been built on it. Buildings that the tenants had paid to construct and maintain. It was a way to benefit from development without having to finance it himself. There was another crucial advantage to ground leases over selling land outright. When you sell property, you get a lump sum payment, which you can invest elsewhere, but you lose all future benefit from the land's appreciation. If you sell a lot for $1,000, and 50 years later it would be worth $100,000, you've missed out on that appreciation. But with a ground lease, you retain ownership and continue to benefit as the land becomes more valuable. When leases came up for renewal, or when they expired and reverted to the landlord, the terms could be renegotiated to reflect the land's increased value. Astor understood all of this with a clarity that was unusual for his time. Most wealthy merchants of the early 19th century kept their money in trading ventures, in ships and cargo and commercial enterprises that required constant attention and management. Real estate was often seen as less prestigious, less dynamic. Something for old money to invest in conservatively, but not something for ambitious, rising men. Astor thought differently. He saw that real estate, properly chosen and properly structured, could generate returns that compounded over decades without requiring the intense management that his fur trading business demanded. So he began buying. In 1810, in 1815, in 1820, throughout this period, whenever he had profits from the fur trade or the China trade, a substantial portion went into Manhattan real estate. He bought farms from aging farmers who were ready to retire and sell. He bought at tax sales when property owners failed to pay their taxes. He bought at foreclosure auctions when mortgages went unpaid. He wasn't sentimental about these purchases. If a widow was losing her late husband's farm because she couldn't pay the mortgage, Astor would buy it at auction for whatever price he could negotiate. He saw these transactions as business, not charity, and he drove hard bargains. This ruthlessness, and there's no other word for it, earned him a reputation. He was not beloved. People respected his business acumen, but not his character. Stories circulated about his aggressive collection of rents, his willingness to evict tenants who fell behind on payments, his habit of buying property from people in distressed circumstances and paying as little as possible. These stories were largely true. Astor operated by the principle that business was business, that sentiment had no place in commercial transactions, that his obligation was to maximize returns, not to be generous or kind. But let's also understand the context. The early 19th century was not an era of welfare programs or social safety nets. Charity existed certainly through churches and private benevolent societies, but there was no expectation that wealthy men should forgo profitable transactions out of concern for the less fortunate. The prevailing commercial ethic was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. If you made a bad deal, that was your responsibility. Astor was operating within the norms of his time, even if he was more aggressive and less generous than some of his peers. One of Astor's most significant real estate acquisitions involved dealings with Trinity Church, one of New York's oldest and wealthiest institutions. Trinity Church owned substantial land in Manhattan, granted to it in the colonial era. By the early 1800s, some of this land was becoming quite valuable as the city expanded. Astor negotiated leases on church-owned property, and he also purchased some land from the church outright. These transactions were complex and took years to complete, involving negotiations with church trustees and legal arrangements that had to navigate both property law and ecclesiastical law. The details of exactly which parcels Astor acquired from Trinity Church and which he leased are lost in historical complexity, but the outcome was clear. He controlled substantial property in Lower Manhattan that was producing steady rental income. As the area around Wall Street and Lower Broadway developed into the city's commercial heart, property values soared, and Astor's holdings appreciated accordingly. He was also buying property in areas that were still quite remote from the developed city. In the 1820s, he purchased substantial acreage in what is now the Upper West Side of Manhattan, land that wouldn't be seriously developed for another 50 or 60 years. To most observers, this seemed like a waste of capital, buying land so far from the city that it had almost no immediate value. But Astor was thinking in generational time frames. He was buying for his children and grandchildren, making investments that might not pay off fully in his lifetime, but that would create enduring wealth for his heirs. The financing of these purchases is worth considering. Astor didn't buy land with cash exclusively. He often used mortgages, borrowing money to leverage his purchases. This was relatively uncommon among wealthy men of the time, who tended to avoid debt. But Astor understood that borrowed money, properly used, could amplify returns. If he could borrow at, say, 6% interest and buy land that would appreciate at 10 or 12% per year as the city grew, the difference was profit earned on borrowed money. He was comfortable with this leverage because he had steady income from his commercial businesses to service the debt, and he was confident in his assessment of Manhattan's growth trajectory. There's something almost meditative about Astor's real estate strategy when you think about it carefully. While his fur trading business required constant activity, ships sailing, traders travelling, deals being negotiated, prices fluctuating, his real estate holdings just sat there, quietly appreciating year after year. The land didn't require management in the way that active businesses did. It didn't need to be fed or repaired or transported. It just existed, and as the city grew around it, it became more valuable. The income from ground rents was predictable and stable. Tenants might come and go, but the land remained, and someone would always need to use it. Picture Astor in his later 50s and early 60s still actively managing the American Fur Company, but increasingly focused on property. He would review maps of Manhattan, marking properties he owned in one colour and properties he wanted to acquire in another. He would ride in his carriage through areas of the city, examining neighbourhoods, watching where development was moving, identifying which properties would be most strategic to acquire next. He would meet with lawyers to structure ground leases, with brokers to identify properties for sale, with bankers to arrange financing. This work was less physically demanding than his early years travelling to the frontier to buy furs, but it required the same patient, strategic thinking that had made him successful in the fur trade. By the late 1820s, a major event was transforming New York's position in American commerce and making Astor's real estate strategy even more prescient. The Erie Canal opened in 1825, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie and thus providing a water route from New York City to the entire Great Lakes region and the growing Midwest. This was a transportation revolution. Suddenly, goods could move from the interior of the continent to New York far more cheaply and easily than before. The canal made New York the nation's dominant port, the natural funnel through which Midwestern grain, lumber, and manufactured goods would flow to eastern markets and Europe. The Erie Canal's impact on New York City's growth was immediate and dramatic. The city's population, which had been around 125,000 in 1820, grew to over 200,000 by 1830. Businesses relocated to New York to take advantage of the canal trade. Immigrants arriving from Europe increasingly chose New York as their destination because it offered the most opportunities. Warehouses, docks, offices, shops, all of these multiplied to serve the growing commerce flowing through the canal. And all of this growth meant increased demand for land and buildings in Manhattan. The city expanded northward at an accelerating pace. Areas that had been farmland in 1820 were subdivided into building lots by 1830. streets were laid out according to the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which had established the grid pattern of numbered streets and avenues that would characterize most of Manhattan. Property values rose steadily, and then more than steadily. They began to soar in areas where development was actively occurring. Astor's holdings, purchased when land was cheap, were now worth multiples of what he had paid, and because he had structured most of his ownership through ground leases rather than outright sales, he retained this appreciation. The annual ground rents he collected grew as he leased more parcels. By 1830, rental income from real estate was becoming a significant portion of his total income, rivaling and beginning to exceed profits from the fur trade. Let yourself pause here for a moment and consider the transformation. A man who had built his fortune buying and selling fur pelts was becoming, without most people realizing it yet, primarily a real estate investor. The shift was gradual enough that it didn't seem dramatic at any single point, but over the course of the 1820s, the center of gravity of his wealth moved from commerce to property, from active trading to passive ownership, from income generated by his own efforts to income generated by the city's growth. This shift also involved a change in how Astor spent his time and energy. The fur trade still required attention. He didn't fully exit the American Fur Company until 1834, but increasingly he could delegate daily operations to employees and partners, while he focused on strategic decisions. Real estate, once he had acquired the properties and structured the leases, required less active management. His lawyers handled lease negotiations and collections. His agents identified properties to acquire. Astor made the big decisions but didn't need to be involved in every detail. This allowed him more time for other pursuits. He became more involved in civic affairs, serving on boards of charitable institutions and cultural organizations. He was a founder and significant benefactor of what would become the New York Public Library, though in his time it was called the Astor Library. This philanthropy served multiple purposes. It was genuinely charitable, providing public benefit. But it also enhanced his reputation and social standing, transforming him from a merely wealthy merchant into a civic leader and cultural patron. His relationship with other wealthy New York families also evolved during this period. In his early years, Astor was an outsider, a German immigrant, a fur trader, someone who worked with his hands and dealt with the rough frontiersmen. But wealth has a way of smoothing over such distinctions. By the 1820s and 30s, Astor was moving in the same social circles as the old Dutch and English families who had dominated New York society. His children married into these families. His business dealings increasingly involved partnerships with men from old money. He was becoming, despite his humble origins and German accent, a member of New York's aristocracy. But he never entirely shed the habits and personality traits that had made him successful. He remained frugal in his personal habits, wearing clothes until they were threadbare, living in a house that was comfortable, but not ostentatious by the standards of the very wealthy. He continued to pay close attention to accounts, and would personally review rent collection records to ensure no one was cheating him. Stories are told of him haggling over small sums, refusing to pay bills he considered excessive, conducting himself more like a shopkeeper than a millionaire. This parsimony was partly temperament. He had grown up poor and never entirely trusted that wealth would last, but it was also strategic. Money saved was money that could be invested, and investments compounded over time. In 1834, Astor made one of the most important decisions of his business career. He sold the American Fur Company to a consortium of partners and competitors, exiting the fur trade entirely. The sale price was substantial, accounts vary, but he likely received several $100,000 for his interest in the company. More importantly, he was freeing himself from the active management of a business that was becoming increasingly challenging. The fur trade was changing in ways that made it less attractive. Beaver populations in the most accessible areas were depleted from decades of trapping, forcing traders to venture into more remote territories where operations were more expensive and dangerous. Fashion was shifting away from beaver felt hats towards silk hats, reducing demand. Competition had intensified as more traders entered the business. The American Fur Company was still profitable, but the margins were shrinking and the work was becoming harder. Astor, now in his early 70s, was ready to focus entirely on managing his real estate holdings and enjoying the wealth he had accumulated. The timing of his exit from the fur trade was characteristically shrewd. He sold while the business was still valuable, before the decline became obvious to everyone. Within a decade, the fur trade would be much less profitable than it had been in its heyday, and some of the buyers of the American Fur Company would regret their purchase. But Astor had gotten out at the right time, converting what might have become a declining asset into cash that he promptly reinvested in more Manhattan real estate. By the mid-1830s, Astor's strategy was fully formed, and his fortune was primarily based on property ownership. He owned or controlled hundreds of parcels throughout Manhattan. Some were in highly developed areas of lower Manhattan, generating substantial rental income. Others were in areas that were just beginning to develop, positioned to appreciate rapidly as the city's expansion reached them. Still others were in areas that were still farmland but that Astor believed would eventually be urbanized, long-term holdings that required patience but that would create wealth for future generations. The structure he had created was almost perfect for wealth preservation. Real estate in a growing city appreciates reliably over time. Ground leases provide steady income without requiring active management. The land itself is indestructible. It can't burn down or sink or be stolen, unlike ships or merchandise. And property ownership, particularly when structured through ground leases that revert to the owner after a set term, creates generational wealth that can pass to heirs with relative simplicity. Astor was consciously building not just his own wealth, but a family fortune that would endure. He was thinking about his children and grandchildren, about creating a foundation of wealth that would allow them to live comfortably for generations, without having to work in active businesses as he had done. This multi-generational perspective was unusual among self-made men, who often assumed their children would continue the family business. Astor took a different approach. He would extract himself from active business, convert his wealth into real estate, and structure that real estate in ways that would generate income perpetually. If you're feeling sleepy, let the image of Manhattan slowly growing northward carry you into rest. Picture the farms being subdivided into lots, the streets being graded and paved, the wooden buildings giving way to brick and then stone, the city expanding year by year, decade by decade, and the Astor land sitting patiently, waiting for the wave of development to reach them, and when it did, becoming immensely valuable almost effortlessly. There's something soothing about this patient vision, this understanding that some kinds of wealth grow naturally with time, requiring not frantic activity but strategic positioning and the willingness to wait. By 1840, New York City's population had grown to over 300,000, and Manhattan was transforming from a small city clustered at its southern tip into a major metropolis spreading northward along the island. The numbered streets of the grid plan were being developed one by one, and Astor owned significant property along many of them. His annual income from rents was enormous by the standards of the time, likely well over $100,000 per year, making him one of the highest-earning individuals in America, and this was passive income, generated by assets he had accumulated over decades of patient buying. He had achieved something remarkable. He had started with nothing, built a fortune through the fur trade, and then converted that fortune into a different form of wealth that was more stable, more enduring, and that would benefit his descendants for generations. The strategy required patience that most men didn't have, a willingness to hold assets for decades without seeing immediate returns, and the vision to recognize that Manhattan's growth was not just a possibility, but an inevitability. Astor had all of these qualities, and he had acted on them systematically over more than 3 decades of real estate investing. The results spoke for themselves. The butcher's son from Walldorf was now the richest man in America. By the early 1840s, John Jacob Astor had achieved a position in American society that would have been unimaginable to the young immigrant who arrived in Baltimore with 7 flutes nearly 60 years earlier. He was, by most estimations, the wealthiest person in the United States. His fortune was variously estimated at between $15 and $20 million, an almost incomprehensible sum in an era when the entire federal budget was perhaps $25 million per year. To put this in perspective, if you earned $1,000 per year, which was a very comfortable income for a professional man at the time, it would take you 20,000 years to accumulate what Astor had amassed in a single lifetime. But wealth on this scale isn't just about numbers in account books. It's about power, influence, and how a person moves through the world. Let's try to understand what John Jacob Astor's daily life looked like in these later years, how he was perceived by his contemporaries, and what his wealth actually meant in practical terms. Astor lived in a mansion on Broadway, in what was then one of the most fashionable parts of Lower Manhattan. The house was large and well appointed, but not extravagant by the standards of the very wealthy. It was furnished with European furniture and art, but Astor had never been particularly interested in luxury for its own sake. He lived comfortably, certainly, with servants and carriages and fine food, but he didn't display his wealth ostentatiously. His personal habits remained relatively simple. He wore good clothes, but not the latest fashions. He ate well, but not lavishly. He maintained the frugal habits of a man who remembered poverty and didn't entirely trust prosperity. His daily routine in these later years was orderly and predictable. He would rise early, despite his advancing age. He would review correspondence and business documents, though by this point he had lawyers and agents handling most of the details of his real estate empire. He would receive visitors, people seeking loans, business partners reporting on various ventures, civic leaders asking for charitable contributions, family members with requests or updates. He would take carriage rides through the city, examining his properties, watching the endless construction and development that was transforming Manhattan block by block. He moved slowly now. He was in his late 70s and early 80s during this final decade of his life. An age had diminished his physical vigour, though not his mental acuity. He had begun to suffer from various ailments common to elderly men of the era: digestive problems, aching joints, failing eyesight. But his mind remained sharp, his memory for business details intact, his judgment as sound as ever. People who met with him in these years reported that he could recall transactions from decades earlier, could cite specific terms of leases signed 40 years before, could calculate rental yields and property values in his head with remarkable accuracy. His reputation in New York society was complex. He was respected. One had to respect the richest man in America. But he was not particularly liked. The qualities that had made him successful in business, the ruthless bargaining, the willingness to foreclose on those who couldn't pay, the single-minded focus on profit, did not endear him to people. Stories circulated about his tight-fistedness, his harsh treatment of tenants, his cold commercial dealings. Some of these stories were exaggerated or apocryphal, but many were based in truth. Astor operated on the principle that sentiment had no place in business, and he held to this principle even when it made him unpopular. There's a famous story, possibly apocryphal but widely believed, about Astor's rent collection practices. It was said that he would personally review rent rolls and would notice if any tenant was even a day late with payment. His agents would be dispatched immediately to collect, with instructions to begin eviction proceedings if the rent was not paid within hours. Whether this specific story is true or not, it captures something real about Astor's approach. He believed that allowing leniency encouraged irresponsibility, that tenants needed to understand their obligations were absolute, that exceptions made for one person would lead to demands from others. This hardness extended to his family relationships as well. He loved his children, certainly, but he also saw them as heirs to a fortune that needed to be managed responsibly. And he worried constantly about whether they had the character and judgment to preserve what he had built. His wife Sarah had died in 1842, and her loss affected him deeply. She had been his partner in every sense for more than 50 years, and her absence left a void that couldn't be filled. In his final years, he became somewhat isolated, surrounded by family and servants, but fundamentally alone in the way that very wealthy, very old men often are. But let's step back and consider his position in the broader context of American society in the 1840s, because Astor represented something new in the American experience. The United States had been founded partly in reaction to European aristocracy, with its hereditary titles and inherited privileges. The American ideal was supposed to be equality of opportunity, a society where merit rather than birth determined one's position. But Astor's wealth created something that looked very much like aristocracy. His fortune was so large that his descendants could live in luxury for generations without working. He was creating, in effect, an American aristocratic class, even without titles or formal nobility. This troubled some observers. Was a republic compatible with such enormous concentrations of wealth? Could democracy survive if some families commanded resources that dwarfed the assets of entire states? These questions were being debated in newspapers and political forums, and Astor's fortune was often cited as an example of the dangers of unchecked capitalism. Some argued for laws to limit inheritance, to break up large estates, to prevent the creation of permanent wealthy classes. Others defended Astor's right to keep what he had earned and to pass it to his children as he saw fit. Astor himself seemed largely indifferent to these debates. He had worked within the law to build his fortune, and he expected the law to protect his right to dispose of it as he wished. He didn't justify his wealth in ideological terms or claim that it served some greater social purpose. He simply accepted it as the natural result of his intelligence, his effort, and his judgment. He had succeeded where others had failed, and the wealth was his reward and his right. His relationships with other wealthy families were cordial but not particularly warm. The Vanderbilts were beginning their rise, building a fortune in shipping and railroads. The Roosevelts were established old money, descended from Dutch settlers and active in New York politics and society. Various other families, the Gurlitz, the Rhinelanders, the Beekmans, owned substantial property and businesses. Astor interacted with these families in business dealings and social occasions, but he remained somewhat apart, an outsider even at the top of society because of his immigrant origins and his commercial background. His children married into some of these established families, which was partly about love but also about strategy. Marriage alliances were a way to cement business relationships and to integrate the Astor family more firmly into New York's social elite. His eldest son, William Backhouse Astor, married Margaret Rebecca Armstrong from a respectable, though not particularly wealthy family. His daughter Dorothea married Walter Langdon, a lawyer and politician. These marriages were approved and encouraged by John Jacob, who understood that his grandchildren's position in society would depend partly on the social standing of their mothers' families. But the marriage of his younger son, John Jacob Astor Jr., troubled him greatly. The young man had married and then divorced, which was scandalous in an era when divorce was rare and socially destructive. He remarried, lived abroad much of the time, and seemed uninterested in the family business. Father and son were estranged for periods, and John Jacob worried that this son lacked the character and judgment to be a responsible heir. This concern influenced how he structured his will, as we'll discuss shortly. Despite his personal frugality and his reputation for hardness in business, Astor did engage in philanthropy, though on his own terms and for his own reasons. His most significant charitable act was the establishment of the Astor Library, which he funded through his will with an endowment of $400,000. This library would eventually merge with other collections to form the New York Public Library, one of the world's great research institutions. The gesture was motivated partly by genuine public-spiritedness. Astor believed in education and knowledge, and partly by a desire for legacy, for his name to be remembered for something beyond money-making. He also made smaller charitable donations during his lifetime to various causes: churches, orphanages, institutions for the poor. These donations were never lavish by the standards of his wealth, and he gave them somewhat grudgingly, as if charity was an obligation to be discharged efficiently rather than an opportunity for generosity. He would examine each request carefully, questioning whether the cause was worthy, whether the money would be used effectively, whether there might be some benefit to him in terms of reputation or business connections. This calculating approach to charity was characteristic. Even his generosity had to serve multiple purposes. The Astor House, a hotel he had built in the 1830s, was one of his few ventures into development rather than just landholding. The hotel was located on Broadway, a massive building by the standards of the time, with more than 300 rooms. It was luxurious, featuring the latest amenities: indoor plumbing, gas lighting, elegant furnishings. It quickly became the premier hotel in New York, hosting visiting dignitaries, wealthy travelers, important social events. The hotel was profitable, of course, but it also served as a monument to Astor's wealth and success, a physical manifestation of his fortune that everyone could see and admire. Let yourself picture the Astor House in its early years: the grand lobby with marble floors, the dining room filled with well-dressed guests, the busy staff attending to every need. The building represented a level of luxury and service that was new to America, borrowed from the great hotels of Europe but adapted to American tastes and sensibilities. It was both a business and a statement, saying that New York had arrived as a world-class city, that American wealth could create spaces as elegant as anything in London or Paris. Astor's involvement with other leading men of his era was primarily commercial rather than personal. He knew President Martin Van Buren, who had been a New York politician before his presidency, and who moved in the same circles as the city's wealthy elite. He had business dealings with various congressmen and senators, particularly on matters relating to tariffs and trade policy. But he was not politically active in the way some wealthy men were. He didn't seek office, didn't make large political donations, didn't try to shape policy directly. His influence was exercised more subtly through his control of property that businesses needed, through his financial connections, through the simple fact that elected officials had to consider the interests of the wealthiest man in their city. As Astor moved through his late 70s and into his 80s, he began to think seriously about succession. He had built an enormous fortune. But what would happen to it after his death? How could he ensure it would be preserved and managed wisely? How should he divide it among his children and grandchildren? These questions occupied him increasingly as he felt his health declining and understood that his time was limited. The challenge of generational wealth transfer is one that every successful businessman faces eventually. But it was particularly acute for Astor because of the size of his fortune, and because wealth on this scale was so unusual in America at the time. There were few models to follow, few established practices for managing multi-million-dollar estates. He would have to create a structure largely from first principles. Guided by his own judgment and the advice of his lawyers, his primary concern was that the fortune should remain intact rather than being divided into small pieces that would dissipate over generations. He'd seen what happened when estates were split equally among many heirs. Each one received something, but none received enough to maintain the family's position, and within a generation or two the wealth was scattered and diminished. He wanted to avoid this outcome. He wanted the Astor fortune to endure as a concentrated mass of wealth, providing for his descendants in perpetuity. The solution he arrived at was a form of primogeniture adapted to American circumstances. The bulk of his estate would go to his eldest son, William Backhouse Astor. William would inherit most of the real estate, most of the rental income, most of the wealth. The other children and grandchildren would receive bequests, substantial sums by ordinary standards, hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases, but nothing like what William would receive. This concentration of wealth in a single heir was controversial and upset some family members, but Astor was convinced it was the right approach. William had demonstrated in his father's judgment the qualities necessary to manage the fortune. He was conservative, careful, responsible. He lacked his father's entrepreneurial drive and vision. He would never have built the fortune in the first place, but he had the temperament to preserve it. He understood real estate, having worked alongside his father for years. He was not extravagant in his personal habits. He could be trusted to maintain the properties, collect the rents, reinvest wisely, and eventually pass the fortune to his own heir in similar fashion. Astor's daughter Dorothea would receive a substantial bequest but not an equal share. His younger son, John Jacob Astor Jr., with whom relations were strained, would receive much less than William, a decision that reflected both their difficult relationship and John Jacob's assessment that his younger son lacked the character to handle great wealth responsibly. Various grandchildren would receive amounts ranging from $50,000 to several $100,000, comfortable sums that would provide for them, but that represented only a small fraction of the total estate. And then there was the $400,000 bequest for the Astor Library, the philanthropic gesture that would preserve his name for posterity. This represented perhaps 2 or 3% of his total wealth, enough to be meaningful and to create a significant institution, but not so much as to substantially reduce what his heirs would receive. If you're feeling drowsy, let the image of old John Jacob reviewing his will settle in your mind. Picture him in his library, surrounded by ledgers and legal documents, making decisions that would shape his family's future for generations, weighing obligations to different children against the imperative to preserve the fortune intact. The weight of these decisions, the responsibility of disposing of such wealth, the hope that his choices would prove wise long after he was gone. Let these thoughts carry you gently towards sleep. In his final years, Astor's health deteriorated steadily. The various ailments of old age accumulated and worsened. He spent more time in bed, less time going out, though he continued to receive visitors and to oversee his affairs as much as his strength allowed. His mind remained clear almost to the end, and he continued to give instructions to his lawyers and agents about property management and business matters, even on what would be his deathbed. He was thinking about rents and leases and property values, unable to entirely let go of the business that had defined his life. He died on March 29th, 1848, at the age of 84. The cause was simply old age, the gradual failure of a body that had worked hard for 8 decades and could work no longer. He died at home, in his Manhattan mansion, surrounded by family. The funeral was large and well attended, as befitted the richest man in America. But the mourning was more formal than heartfelt. He was respected but not loved, and his passing marked the end of an era more than it marked the loss of a beloved figure. The newspaper obituaries were respectful but not entirely warm. They acknowledged his business genius, his accumulation of unprecedented wealth, his rise from poverty to riches. But they also noted his reputation for hardness, his aggressive business practices, his lack of warmth or generosity. One obituary called him, quote, zero, quote, which was accurate but not exactly affectionate. Another noted that he had, quote, one quote, the word, quote, two, quote, doing considerable work in that sentence. The will was read, and its terms became public knowledge, sparking considerable discussion and some controversy. The concentration of wealth in William's hands was criticised by those who believed in more equal division among heirs. The relatively modest charitable bequests were noted as evidence of Astor's fundamental stinginess, but the will stood, was probated without successful challenge, and the Astor fortune passed to the next generation largely intact, just as John Jacob had planned. His estate was valued at approximately $20 million, making it by far the largest in American history to that point. To understand what this meant, consider that the total wealth of all Americans combined was perhaps $7 billion in 1848. Astor personally owned roughly 1/300th of all the wealth in the country. If we think about modern equivalents, with total American household wealth now in the tens of trillions. A proportional fortune today would be somewhere around $100 billion or more. The scale was simply extraordinary. But more important than the size of the fortune was its composition and structure. This wasn't wealth in the form of businesses that could fail, or ships that could sink, or investments that could collapse. This was overwhelmingly real estate, land and buildings in Manhattan that would continue to exist and to generate rental income regardless of economic conditions. The fortune was built on bedrock in the most literal sense, on the physical island of Manhattan, and it would prove remarkably durable for exactly this reason. John Jacob Astor had achieved what he set out to achieve. He had built a fortune from nothing, had converted that fortune from volatile commercial enterprises into stable property ownership, and had structured the inheritance to preserve the wealth for future generations. He had risen farther and faster than virtually anyone in American history, transforming himself from a butcher's son to the wealthiest man in the nation, and he had done it through intelligence, patience, ruthlessness when necessary, and an almost uncanny ability to recognize and act on opportunities that others missed or ignored. His legacy was complex, as legacies of such men usually are. He had built something remarkable, yes, but he had done so through methods that were sometimes harsh, and in ways that benefited primarily himself and his family, rather than society more broadly. He had demonstrated what was possible in America, that birth need not determine destiny, that an immigrant with nothing could rise to the very top. But he had also demonstrated the cost of such success, the relationships sacrificed, the kindness withheld, the human toll of single-minded pursuit of wealth. Both things were true, and history would remember both. The fortune that John Jacob Astor had spent a lifetime building now passed into the hands of his eldest son, William Backhouse Astor, and with this transfer began a new chapter in the story, one less about building wealth than about maintaining it, less about entrepreneurial vision than about patient stewardship. William inherited an extraordinary responsibility along with his extraordinary wealth, and the question that would define his life was whether he could preserve what his father had created and perhaps even expand upon it. William was 56 years old when his father died in 1848. He was not a young man inheriting unexpectedly, thrust suddenly into responsibility he wasn't prepared for. Rather, he had been groomed for this role for decades, had worked alongside his father in managing the real estate holdings, had learned the business from the inside. He knew which properties were most valuable, which tenants were reliable, which areas of Manhattan were likely to develop next. He understood ground leases and property law, and the rhythms of the New York real estate market. If anyone was prepared to inherit and manage a $20 million fortune, it was William Astor. But preparation and capability are different things, and there were legitimate questions about whether William had the strength of character and judgment that his father had possessed. John Jacob had been a force of nature, aggressive, visionary, willing to take calculated risks, tireless in his pursuit of advantage. William was a different sort of man. He was cautious where his father had been bold, conservative where his father had been opportunistic, content to maintain where his father had been driven to expand. These differences weren't weaknesses exactly, but they were differences, and they would shape how the fortune evolved under William's stewardship. Let's try to understand William as a person, not just as an heir, because his personality and values would determine the Astor family's trajectory for the next quarter century. He was by all accounts a serious and somewhat dull man. He lacked his father's charisma and his mother Sarah's warmth. He was methodical, detail-oriented, conservative in both his business practices and his personal life. He dressed well, but not fashionably. He entertained because his social position required it, not because he enjoyed it. He attended to his duties, managing properties, reviewing accounts, meeting with lawyers and agents, with the same careful attention one might give to any important but not particularly exciting work. His marriage to Margaret Rebecca Armstrong had been stable and had produced children, including a son named John Jacob Astor III, who would eventually inherit in his turn. The marriage was, like many among the wealthy of that era, as much a partnership for managing household and social obligations as a romantic relationship. Margaret ran their household, supervised servants, organised the social events their position demanded, and raised their children to understand both their privileges and their responsibilities. She was a capable woman, though her capabilities were exercised in the domestic sphere in ways that were expected of women of her class and era. William's approach to managing the inherited fortune was straightforward. He would do essentially what his father had done in the final decades, but with even more caution and less innovation. He would collect rents, maintain properties, reinvest profits in more Manhattan real estate, and avoid risks that might endanger the principal. He would not speculate, would not venture into new businesses, would not try to dramatically expand the fortune. His goal was preservation and steady. Predictable growth, not entrepreneurial achievement. This strategy, while it might seem timid, was actually quite intelligent given the circumstances. William understood something important. He had not built this fortune and did not have the special talents that had allowed his father to build it. What he had was a massive revenue-generating asset base in the form of Manhattan real estate, and his job was to not mess it up. Ambitious moves might lead to gains, yes, but they might also lead to losses, and losses from this position of strength were unnecessary and potentially catastrophic. Better to be conservative and preserve the inheritance than to be aggressive and risk losing it. The Manhattan that William inherited was still in the midst of dramatic transformation. The city's population continued to grow rapidly, reaching over 500,000 by the mid-1850s and approaching 800,000 by 1860. The numbered streets continued marching northward, with development reaching into areas that had been wilderness just decades before. Each year, farmland that the elder Astor had purchased for hundreds of dollars per acre was subdivided into building lots worth tens of thousands of dollars. The fortune was growing almost automatically, simply by virtue of the city growing around it. William's management consisted largely of systematizing and professionalizing what his father had done more personally. He employed a staff of agents and lawyers to handle the day-to-day operations, collecting rents, negotiating leases, handling disputes with tenants, identifying properties to purchase. He established regular procedures and record-keeping systems. He was, in essence, transforming the Astor real estate holdings from a personal business into something more like a modern real estate company, with formal processes and division of labor. This professionalization was necessary given the scale of the holdings. By the 1850s, the Astor family owned hundreds of properties scattered throughout Manhattan. Managing this portfolio required more work than one person could handle personally, even with the most diligent effort. William needed agents to inspect properties, collect rents, serve eviction notices, coordinate repairs, negotiate new leases. He needed lawyers to handle legal disputes, review contracts, ensure compliance with property laws. He needed accountants to track income and expenses, calculate tax obligations, prepare financial reports. The fortune had grown too large to be managed informally. But William also maintained his father's fundamental philosophy. The land was the important thing, not the buildings. The Astor family generally did not construct buildings on their properties. Instead, they leased land to others who would build. This meant the family's capital remained in land rather than in structures that could burn down or deteriorate. It also meant they avoided the headaches of building management, dealing with tenants, maintaining heating systems, fixing roofs, all the tiresome details of being a landlord. Ground lease tenants handled all of that. The Astor family simply collected rent on the land and waited for the leases to expire, at which point they would own both the land and whatever buildings had been constructed on it. The wisdom of this approach became clear in the 1850s and 60s as Manhattan experienced rapid building cycles. Buildings would be constructed, would serve their purpose for some decades, and then would be demolished to make way for larger, more modern structures. This churn of the built environment meant that building ownership was risky. Your structure might become obsolete long before it wore out physically. But land ownership was safe. Land couldn't become obsolete, and in a growing city it only became more valuable as density increased and demand for space grew. William also maintained his father's policy of never selling property if it could be avoided. The only reason to sell would be if the offered price was so extraordinary that it couldn't be refused, or if the property was on the periphery of the holdings and not strategic to the core portfolio. For the most part, though, William held everything. This meant the fortune was not particularly liquid. Most of the wealth was in property, not in cash or securities, but liquidity wasn't necessary. The rental income was more than sufficient to cover all expenses and to fund new acquisitions. There was no need to sell property to raise cash. This brings us to an important aspect of the Astor fortune that's easy to overlook. It generated enormous cash flow, but relatively modest liquid wealth. William received perhaps $1 million per year in rental income by the 1850s, an almost incomprehensible sum. But much of this was immediately reinvested in additional property purchases, in improvements to existing holdings, in paying taxes and other carrying costs. The family lived well, certainly, but not at a level that consumed more than a small fraction of their income. The rest went back into the real estate portfolio, compounding year after year. Consider the psychology of the situation. William was receiving more money every year than most men would see in a lifetime, but he couldn't spend it freely because it needed to be preserved and reinvested for future generations. He was incredibly wealthy, but also constrained by his wealth, obligated to be its steward rather than simply its enjoyer. This created a strange sort of golden cage. He had unlimited material comfort, but limited freedom to do anything dramatic or unconventional with the fortune. William's daily life settled into predictable routines. He would rise at a regular hour, breakfast with his family, then spend his mornings reviewing reports from his agents and making decisions about property matters. Were rents being collected promptly? Should a particular lease be renewed or renegotiated? Was there a property available for purchase that fit the family's criteria? These were the questions that occupied him. Afternoons might be spent in meetings with lawyers or bankers, or in carriage rides through Manhattan to inspect properties personally. Evenings were for social obligations, dinners with other wealthy families, attendance at cultural events, the endless round of social performance that his position required. It was, in many ways, a constrained and rather boring life for someone of such wealth. William didn't travel extensively. Why would he, when he needed to be in New York to oversee the properties? He didn't pursue expensive hobbies or passions. He didn't surround himself with artists or intellectuals or adventurers. He lived the life of an extremely wealthy middle manager, competent and responsible, but not particularly interesting or happy. The fortune he had inherited was both his greatest asset and, in some sense, his prison. The social position of the Astor family evolved significantly during William's stewardship. In John Jacob's time, the Astors had been wealthy, but somewhat outside the social elite due to the patriarch's immigrant background and commercial origins. By William's time, this was changing. Wealth had a way of washing away the taint of humble origins, and 2 generations of prosperity was beginning to make the Astors seem like old money, even though they weren't. William's children would marry into established families. The Astor name was becoming synonymous with wealth and social standing. But this social elevation came with obligations and expectations. Wealthy families were expected to patronize the arts, to support charitable institutions, to participate in civic affairs. William fulfilled these obligations dutifully, if not enthusiastically. He made donations to churches, hospitals, and cultural organizations. He served on various boards and committees. He allowed his name to be attached to worthy causes, understanding that this was part of the cost of his position. His philanthropy was never generous by the standards of his wealth. He was his father's son in this regard, careful with money and somewhat reluctant to give it away. But he gave enough to maintain the family's reputation. The 1850s brought significant national turmoil that would eventually culminate in the Civil War, and the Astor fortune was not entirely insulated from these broader events. The question of slavery divided the nation, and New York was caught in complex cross-currents. The city had strong commercial ties to the South. Southern cotton fed northern textile mills, and New York banks financed much of this trade. At the same time, abolitionist sentiment was growing, particularly among intellectuals and reformers. The Astors, like most wealthy New York families, tried to remain politically neutral, not wanting to alienate either Southern business partners or Northern reformers. When war finally came in 1861, it disrupted the economy in various ways. Trade with the South ceased, creating challenges for businesses dependent on that commerce. But the war also created opportunities. The federal government needed to borrow money, to purchase supplies, to house and feed enormous armies. New York's financial and commercial sectors benefited from these wartime needs. Real estate in Manhattan was less directly affected than commercial businesses. People still needed places to live and work. Rent still needed to be paid. So the Astor fortune weathered the war years relatively well. William's son, John Jacob Astor III, was coming of age during this period and beginning to be involved in managing the family properties. He was born in 1822, so he was in his late 30s and early 40s during the war years, old enough to be taking on significant responsibilities, but still subordinate to his father. The relationship between William and his son mirrored in some ways the relationship between John Jacob and William, a father trying to prepare a son to inherit, uncertain whether the son had the necessary qualities, worried about what would happen to the fortune in the next generation. John Jacob III was, if anything, even more conservative and cautious than his father William. He had grown up in wealth, had never known poverty or struggle, had been raised to understand that his primary duty was to preserve the family fortune. This background shaped him in predictable ways. He was risk-averse, conventional, concerned primarily with not making mistakes rather than with achieving gains. He would eventually prove to be an adequate steward of the fortune, but like his father, he would never be mistaken for a visionary or an entrepreneur. Let yourself rest for a moment with this image of generational wealth being passed down, each generation a bit further removed from the hunger and drive that created the fortune initially. Picture William in his later years, reviewing accounts and worrying about his son's readiness to inherit, the weight of stewardship growing heavier with age. The fortune that had been built through aggression and risk was now being managed through caution and conservation. The transformation from creation to preservation was complete. The 1860s and early 70s saw Manhattan continue its inexorable growth. The city spread northward past 40th Street, past 50th, reaching into areas that had been farmland in William's youth. Central Park was designed and constructed, a massive public works project that created a green space in the middle of the island. The park actually enhanced the value of Astor properties near its borders. Land adjacent to the park commanded premium prices for both residential and commercial development. Once again, public investment and city planning worked to the Astors' advantage, increasing the value of their holdings without any effort on their part. The population of New York reached 1 million during this period, making it by far the largest city in America and one of the largest in the world. This growth created enormous demand for housing and commercial space, and the Astor family, owning substantial property throughout the developed areas of Manhattan, benefited accordingly. Rents increased year after year. Property values soared. The fortune that William had inherited at perhaps $20 million in 1848 was likely worth $40 million or more by the 1870s, doubled through a combination of appreciation and reinvestment of income. William's health began to decline in the early 1870s. He was in his 80s now, had outlived his father by a few years, and had managed the family fortune for a quarter century. His life's work had been successful by any reasonable measure. He had preserved the inheritance, had expanded it modestly, had maintained the family's social position, had prepared his son to inherit in his turn. but it had not been a particularly joyful life. He had been weighed down by responsibility, constrained by obligation, living primarily for a future he would not see, working to benefit grandchildren and great-grandchildren he would never know. He died in 1875, at the age of 83, having lived almost exactly the same lifespan as his father. The passing of wealth to the third generation was smooth and uneventful, just as the passing from first to second generation had been. John Jacob Astor III inherited the bulk of the fortune. His siblings received bequests, and the Astor real estate empire continued operating much as it had before, barely disrupted by the change in leadership. This continuity was itself a testament to William's work. He had institutionalized the fortune's management to the point where it could survive generational transitions without crisis. The newspapers noted William's death with respectful obituaries that focused more on his wealth than his character. He was described as having been, quote, 3, which was accurate if somewhat faint praise. He had been worthy in the sense of being responsible and capable, but he had not been distinguished in the sense of being remarkable or memorable. He had played the role assigned to him, the steward of a great fortune, and had played it competently. That was his epitaph. And it was enough. The fortune he left was valued at approximately $50 million, more than twice what he had inherited. This growth had come not from brilliant business decisions or entrepreneurial ventures, but from the simple fact that Manhattan real estate had appreciated steadily over 25 years, and William had held rather than sold. He had, in essence, been a passive beneficiary of New York's growth, though his passivity was strategic. He had resisted temptations to sell, had maintained his father's philosophy, had not been diverted by other opportunities. The discipline required to do nothing but hold valuable property, while others were speculating and trading and trying to get rich quickly, was considerable, even if it didn't seem particularly heroic. As we move from William's death toward the third-generation stewardship of the Astor fortune, consider what had changed and what had remained the same. The wealth had grown enormously, but it was still fundamentally the same kind of wealth, Manhattan real estate held on long-term ground leases. The Astor name was far more prominent socially than it had been in John Jacob's time, but the family's essential role remained the same. They were landlords, collecting rent from the commercial and residential activity of a growing city. The fortune had become more institutionalized and professionally managed, but it still operated on the principles the founder had established. Buy land in the path of development, hold it forever, lease rather than sell, reinvest income in more property. The challenge facing the third generation would be the same challenge that had faced William. Maintain what had been built, don't make catastrophic mistakes, preserve the fortune for the next generation. It was a responsibility without glory, a burden without drama, but it was the price of inheriting such wealth. And John Jacob Astor III, like his father before him, would accept this responsibility and discharge it faithfully. If not brilliantly, the story of the Astors was becoming less about individuals and more about a system of wealth preservation that could persist across generations, surviving the deaths of its creators and managers, enduring as long as Manhattan continued to grow and property continued to appreciate. The fortune that John Jacob Astor III inherited in 1875 was substantial, secure, and growing steadily through the simple appreciation of Manhattan real estate. But by the late 19th century, the Astor family's story was becoming less about the accumulation of wealth. That work had been done by the founder, and more about something equally fascinating and uniquely American. The story was becoming about the transformation of commercial wealth into social power, about the creation of an aristocracy in a nation that had supposedly rejected aristocracy, about one family's role as gatekeeper to the highest levels of society. And at the centre of this transformation stood a woman who had become more famous than any Astor since the founder himself. Her name was Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor, though history knows her simply as Mrs. Astor. She married William Backhouse Astor Jr., who was John Jacob Astor III's younger brother, and through force of personality and absolute conviction in her own social supremacy, she established herself as the undisputed queen of New York society during what came to be called the Gilded Age. Let's try to understand the world that Mrs. Astor inhabited and shaped, because it was a world of extraordinary wealth existing alongside extraordinary poverty, of European-style social rituals transplanted to American soil, of families competing through displays of luxury that would have seemed absurd to earlier generations. The decades after the Civil War saw the rise of industrial capitalism on a scale never before witnessed. Fortunes were being made in railroads, in steel, in oil, in banking. The Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, these families were accumulating wealth that dwarfed even the Astor fortune in some cases, though the Astors remained among the very wealthiest. But wealth alone didn't confer social status, at least not automatically. There was a distinction, fiercely maintained by established families between old money and new money. Old money, families who had been wealthy for at least 2 or 3 generations, considered themselves inherently superior to those who had only recently become rich. The Astors, by the 1870s and 80s, qualified as old money despite having originated with an immigrant butcher's son. 3 generations and the passage of time had conferred legitimacy. New money families, the Vanderbilts particularly, were seen as vulgar. Too recently arrived from common origins to truly belong in the higher social circles. Caroline Astor appointed herself the guardian of these social distinctions. She would decide who was acceptable in society and who was not. She would determine which families could be received in the finest homes and which would be excluded. She did this not through any official authority. There was no formal social registry, no legal basis for her power, but through the simple expedient of controlling access to her own social events and encouraging other established families to follow her lead. If Mrs. Astor didn't receive you, you were not in society, regardless of how much money you had. Picture Caroline Astor as she was in her prime, in the 1880s and 90s. She would have been in her 50s and 60s during this period, a woman of considerable presence and dignity. She dressed in the height of fashion, wearing elaborate gowns that cost thousands of dollars, adorned with jewellery that included some of the finest diamonds in America. Her manner was formal, imperious, utterly assured. She spoke slowly and precisely, expecting to be listened to without interruption. She moved through her world as if it had been created specifically for her pleasure and convenience, which in many ways it had been. Her marriage to William Backhouse Astor Jr. was conventional for her class and time. William was wealthy. He had inherited a substantial portion of the Astor fortune and owned considerable real estate in his own right, but he was not particularly interested in society or social climbing. He preferred spending time on his yacht or at his country estate, leaving his wife to manage their social position. This suited Caroline perfectly. She had the Astor name, the Astor fortune to finance her activities, and essentially free rein to shape New York society as she saw fit. Her primary social venue was her mansion on Fifth Avenue at 34th Street, later replaced by an even grander mansion at 65th Street. The ballroom in her home could accommodate about 400 people comfortably, and this physical constraint became the basis for one of the most famous concepts in Gilded Age society, the 400. Mrs. Astor, with the assistance of a social arbiter named Ward McAllister, determined that there were exactly 400 people in New York who truly mattered socially, 400 people who could be invited to the most exclusive events, 400 people who constituted society with a capital S. The 400 was never an official list, and its membership was somewhat fluid, but the concept itself was powerful. It created a clear boundary between those who belonged and those who didn't. It gave Mrs. Astor and her circle the power to include or exclude based on criteria that were never entirely explicit but that everyone understood. Old family, appropriate behaviour, European cultural sophistication, the right education, the right connections. These things mattered. New money, commercial origins, scandalous behaviour, association with trade or industry. These were marks against one's suitability. Let yourself imagine one of Mrs. Astor's famous balls, perhaps the annual ball she held in January of each year, which was the highlight of the New York social season. The mansion would be decorated elaborately, flowers brought in by the thousands, often from greenhouses or even from Europe if necessary. The ballroom would be lit by thousands of candles and gas lights, later by electric lights when that technology became available. Musicians would play the latest waltzes from Vienna. The guests would arrive in carriages that stretched for blocks, women in gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year, men in white tie and tails, everyone adorned with jewellery and decorations. Mrs. Astor would receive her guests at the top of the grand staircase, standing in a receiving line for hours as hundreds of people filed past. Each one acknowledged with a nod or a few words. She wore a tiara and a stomacher, a decorative panel covered with diamonds. The display of wealth was staggering, but it was also highly ritualized, following patterns borrowed from European courts and adapted to American circumstances. There would be a formal dinner for select guests, followed by dancing that might continue past midnight. The newspapers would report on who attended and what they wore, reinforcing the social hierarchies that these events were designed to maintain. But the competition among wealthy families wasn't limited to balls and dinners. It extended to architecture, to the construction of mansions that were increasingly elaborate, expensive, and ostentatious. Fifth Avenue became a showcase of competitive wealth, with each family trying to outdo the others. The Vanderbilts were particularly aggressive in this regard. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built a mansion at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street that cost $3 million and took years to complete. It was designed in the style of a French chateau, with elaborate carved stonework, imported furnishings, ballrooms and galleries that rivaled European palaces. The younger Vanderbilts, not to be outdone, built their own mansions nearby. William Kissam of Vanderbilt's mansion at Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the most fashionable architect of the era, in the style of a Loire Valley chateau. The interior was filled with European art and furniture, with rooms copied from historical European palaces. The cost was estimated at $11 million for the house and its contents, an almost unimaginable sum that represented the combined income of thousands of working families for their entire lives. This architectural competition put pressure on the Astors to maintain their position. While the family fortune was based on real estate and provided enormous income, the Astors had traditionally been somewhat conservative in their personal spending. But Caroline Astor understood that in the competition for social supremacy, visible displays of wealth mattered. She pushed for increasingly elaborate residences, for jewels and furnishings and entertainments that would demonstrate that the Astors could match or exceed anything the Vanderbilts or other families could produce. The relationship between the Astors and the Vanderbilts was complex and often tense. The Vanderbilts had more money, the railroad fortune was immense, but the Astors had social precedence, or at least claimed it. Caroline Astor initially refused to recognize the Vanderbilts socially, considering them too recently arrived from common origins. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder of that fortune, had started as a ferry operator and had built his wealth through ruthless business practices that Mrs. Astor found distasteful. But the younger Vanderbilts, particularly Alva Vanderbilt, who married William Kissam Vanderbilt, were determined to break into the highest social circles. The breakthrough came in 1883 with a famous ball that Alva Vanderbilt hosted at her new mansion to celebrate its completion. She invited 1,200 guests and spared no expense on decorations and entertainment. The event was so elaborate, so talked about, that it became impossible to ignore. And here's where the story becomes interesting. Caroline Astor's daughter Carrie very much wanted to attend this ball, but Alva Vanderbilt had not invited Caroline Astor herself, because Mrs. Astor had never formally acknowledged Mrs. Vanderbilt socially. The message was clear. If you don't recognize us, your daughter can't attend our events. This forced Caroline Astor's hand. She made a formal call on Mrs. Vanderbilt, leaving her calling card, which in the social code of the time was an acknowledgement that Mrs. Vanderbilt was a person worth recognizing. The Vanderbilts had won this round of social warfare, and Mrs. Astor's daughter attended the ball. From that point forward, the Vanderbilts were accepted in the higher circles, though tensions and competition between the families continued. This might all seem trivial or even silly from a modern perspective. Wealthy people competing over guest lists and dress codes and who acknowledged whom. But for the people involved, these social distinctions were deeply serious. Social status determined marriage prospects for one's children. It determined business opportunities, as commercial deals were often made in social settings. It determined one's sense of identity and worth. For women particularly, who were largely excluded from direct participation in business or politics, social position was one of the few areas where they could exercise real power and influence. Within the Astor family itself, the competitive dynamics of the Gilded Age created interesting tensions. William Walldorf Astor, the son of John Jacob Astor III, was the primary heir to the main line of the family fortune, but he had a difficult relationship with his Aunt Caroline Astor, who as Mrs. Astor controlled the family's social position. William Walldorf wanted to be seen as the head of the Astor family, but Caroline refused to defer to him socially. She considered herself Mrs. Astor, the Mrs. Astor, and she wasn't about to yield precedence to her nephew. This family tension manifested in various ways, but most dramatically in a real estate development that would become one of New York's most famous landmarks. William Walldorf, frustrated with his aunt and with New York society generally, decided in the early 1890s to build a hotel on the site of his mansion at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street. This was a deliberately provocative move. Caroline Astor's mansion was right next door at 34th Street, and having a hotel built next to one's residence was considered socially diminishing. Hotels meant commercial activity, strangers coming and going, noise and disturbance, everything that a refined residence was supposed to be protected from. The hotel that William Walldorf built was named the Walldorf, after the family's ancestral village in Germany, a reference back to the very origins of the Astor fortune. It opened in 1893 and was immediately successful, offering a level of luxury and service that was new to American hotels. But more importantly, it was a statement. William Walldorf asserting his independence and his control over his own property, regardless of his aunt's wishes. Caroline Astor was reportedly furious, but she was also trapped. She couldn't complain too publicly without seeming petty, and William Walldorf was within his rights to do what he wanted with his own land. But she had a nephew, John Jacob Astor IV, who was William Walldorf's cousin, and together they hatched a plan. If William Walldorf could build a hotel next to her mansion, she would have her nephew build an even grander hotel on the site of her own mansion after she moved elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened. Caroline Astor moved to a new mansion further uptown at 65th Street, and her nephew John Jacob Astor IV built the Astoria Hotel on the site of her former residence. The Astoria opened in 1897, even more elaborate and luxurious than the Walldorf, with 16 stories and more than 500 rooms. The two hotels stood side by side, both bearing Astor names, both products of family rivalry and competition, but rather than remaining separate, they eventually merged operations, becoming the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most famous hotels in the world. Picture these two massive buildings standing together on Fifth Avenue, monuments to both wealth and family discord. The Waldorf Astoria would operate in this location for decades, hosting presidents and foreign dignitaries, society balls and important business meetings. It became an institution, a symbol of New York luxury and sophistication. And it all came about because two branches of the Astor family couldn't get along, couldn't agree on who held precedence, turned their conflict into competing hotel developments that ended up being combined into something greater than either had intended. The irony is rich. A family that had made its fortune in real estate, that had always held rather than sold property, that had built its wealth through patient accumulation and retention of assets. This family ended up constructing 2 hotels primarily as moves in a social and familial power struggle. The hotels were profitable, certainly, but that wasn't really why they were built. They were built to make points, to assert dominance, to demonstrate that Astor wealth could create monuments to rival anything anyone else could produce. If you're feeling sleepy, let the image of the Walldorf Astoria in its early years settle in your mind. Picture the grand entrance, the doormen in elaborate uniforms, the guests arriving in carriages and later in automobiles, the endless flow of wealth and privilege through its doors. The hotel as a symbol of an era, of American wealth trying to create instant tradition and European-style sophistication, of families competing through architecture and display. Let that image carry you gently toward rest. The Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe this era, was marked by extreme contrasts. While the Astors and Vanderbilts and other wealthy families were building mansions and hosting balls that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, the majority of New Yorkers lived in tenements, worked in dangerous factories, struggled to afford basic necessities. The gap between rich and poor was as wide as it had ever been in American history, and it was particularly visible in New York, where mansion and tenement often existed within blocks of each other. The wealthy were not entirely unaware of these conditions, but they tended to view poverty as either the natural order of things or as the result of personal failings rather than structural problems. Charity was encouraged. Mrs. Astor and other society women participated in various charitable organizations, attended fundraising events, donated money to worthy causes. But this charity was generally paternalistic, offering limited help while maintaining the existing social and economic structures. The idea that the economic system itself might need fundamental reform, that wealth might be better distributed through different policies, these ideas existed among reformers and labor organizers, but were considered radical and dangerous by the wealthy. The Astor fortune continued to grow through this period, reaching perhaps $100 million or more by the turn of the 20th century. This growth came primarily from the steady appreciation of Manhattan real estate, as the city's population approached 3.5 million people by 1900. The Astors owned property throughout Manhattan, from the southern tip to well into the upper reaches of the island. The rental income from all these properties was enormous, likely several $1 million per year, far more than even the most lavish lifestyle could consume. But the fortune was also becoming more diffused across family members. John Jacob Astor III had died in 1890, leaving the bulk of his estate to his son William Walldorf Astor, the one who built the Walldorf Hotel. But John Jacob Astor IV, Caroline Astor's son, also inherited substantial wealth. Various other family members received bequests. The Astor fortune was no longer as concentrated in a single heir as it had been in earlier generations, though the main line still controlled the largest share. William Walldorf Astor, who inherited the primary fortune in 1890, had an interesting and somewhat unusual career. He was ambitious not just for wealth, but for political and social recognition. He served briefly in the New York State Legislature and as U.S. Minister to Italy. But he found American politics frustrating, and American society, despite his wealth, somewhat resistant to his ambitions. Caroline Astor's social dominance irritated him, and he increasingly felt that in America he would always be merely rich rather than truly powerful or respected. So in 1891, in one of the most dramatic moves in the family's history, William Walldorf Astor moved permanently to England. He took his family, his fortune, and his ambitions across the Atlantic, essentially abandoning America for Britain. This was unusual. Wealthy Americans might maintain European residences or spend seasons abroad, but to permanently relocate to essentially become British was rare, and was seen by many as a betrayal of sorts. In England, William Walldorf found what he'd been seeking: British society was more hierarchical, more willing to grant status to wealth, more comfortable with aristocracy. He purchased estates, became involved in British social and political life, and eventually was granted a peerage, becoming Viscount Astor. His descendants would become part of the British establishment, with several serving in Parliament and playing significant roles in British politics and society. The American Astors had spawned a British branch, a remarkable transformation for a family that had begun with a German immigrant to America just over a century earlier. Meanwhile, in America, Caroline Astor continued to reign over New York society until her health began to fail in the early 1900s. Her influence was waning as the world changed around her. The strict social hierarchies she had enforced were beginning to seem outdated. New money was becoming more difficult to exclude as fortunes multiplied and social mobility increased. The Gilded Age was giving way to a new era, and Mrs. Astor's style of social dictatorship was becoming a relic of the past. She died in 1908, at the age of 78, and with her death an era truly ended. The newspapers covered her passing extensively, but the tone was often more historical than mournful. She represented a particular moment in American social history, the late 19th century attempt to create European-style aristocracy in a democratic republic. That moment was passing, and while the wealthy would continue to exist and to exercise influence, they would do so differently, less overtly, with less of the public display and social rigidity that had characterized Mrs. Astor's reign. The Waldorf Astoria continued to operate and thrive, a lasting monument to the Gilded Age and to the Astor family's prominence. But the family itself was changing, becoming less unified, less focused on a single fortune and a single social position. The American branch and the British branch had diverged. Within the American branch, various family members pursued different paths. Some remained focused on real estate and wealth management. Others became involved in politics, society, charitable work, various endeavours that wealth made possible. The story of the Astors during the Gilded Age teaches us something about the nature of wealth and social power in America. Wealth alone wasn't quite enough to guarantee social position. It had to be combined with the right background, the right behaviour, the right connections. But wealth could buy a path to social acceptance, could fund the displays and entertainments that impressed people, could eventually, over a generation or two, transform a merchant family into something resembling aristocracy. The process wasn't automatic or immediate, but it was possible, and the Astors navigated it successfully, using their fortune to establish a social position that would have been unthinkable for their immigrant founder. As we move forward from the Gilded Age into the early 20th century, the Astor story will continue to evolve, shaped by tragedy and by the changing nature of American society. But the foundations laid during this period, the family's position at the apex of American wealth and society, the division into American and British branches, the transformation of commercial fortune into something approaching hereditary privilege, these would influence everything that came after. The early 20th century brought changes to American society that would challenge the world the Astors and their peers had created during the Gilded Age. The certainties of the late 1800s, the rigid social hierarchies, the unchallenged dominance of old money families, the assumption that wealth conferred not just comfort but genuine social superiority. All of these were beginning to erode, and for the Astor family this new century would bring both continued prosperity and a tragedy that would become one of the most famous disasters in history, marking symbolically the end of an era. John Jacob Astor IV, the son of Caroline Astor and the man who had built the Astoria Hotel, was in many ways a representative figure of his generation. He was born in 1864 into enormous wealth and privilege, never knowing anything but comfort and social position. He grew up in mansions, was educated at the finest schools, travelled extensively in Europe, and inherited a substantial portion of the Astor fortune when he came of age. By the early 1900s, he was one of the wealthiest men in America. with a fortune estimated at somewhere between $80 and $150 million. Accounts vary, but any figure in that range made him extraordinarily rich by any measure. But John Jacob Astor IV was more than just a wealthy heir living off inherited property. He had an inventive mind and intellectual curiosity that set him apart from many men of his class. He held several patents for mechanical devices, improvements to bicycle brakes, a turbine engine, a pneumatic road improver, various other inventions that showed genuine technical knowledge and creativity. He wrote a science fiction novel called __4_ that imagined space travel and life on other planets, published in 1894 to modest literary reception, but demonstrating his imagination and interest in technology and progress. He also served briefly in the Spanish-American War in 1898. Volunteering despite having no military obligation and no need to prove himself through martial service. He financed and commanded a volunteer artillery battery, saw some action in Cuba, and emerged from the war with the rank of lieutenant colonel, a title he would use for the rest of his life. This military service was partly patriotism, partly a desire for adventure and purpose beyond the management of real estate holdings, partly perhaps a need to prove that he was more than just a rich man's son. Let yourself picture Colonel Astor in these years, in his 30s and 40s, at the height of his physical and intellectual powers. He was tall, distinguished-looking, with a formal bearing that came naturally to someone of his background. He had dark hair beginning to grey at the temples, a neatly trimmed moustache in the fashion of the time, eyes that were observant and intelligent. He dressed impeccably but conservatively, in the well-tailored suits and formal wear appropriate to his station. He moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been denied anything, who had never had to wonder where the next meal would come from, or whether he could afford something he wanted. His first marriage, to Ava Lal Willing in 1891, produced 2 children, a son Vincent and a daughter Ava. The marriage was socially appropriate. Ava came from a prominent Philadelphia family, but it was not particularly happy. The couple lived increasingly separate lives, and by the early 1900s they had effectively separated, though divorce was still scandalous enough that they didn't pursue it immediately. Ava Willing Astor spent much of her time in England and in Europe, while John Jacob remained primarily in New York, managing his properties and pursuing his interests. In 1909, the couple finally divorced, which was newsworthy enough given their social position, but not entirely shocking by the standards of the early 20th century. Divorce was becoming more common among the wealthy, though it still carried social costs. But what happened next created a genuine scandal that fascinated and horrified New York society. In 1911, at the age of 47, John Jacob Astor married 18-year-old Madeline Talmadge Force. The age difference, 29 years, was striking enough. But more than that, Madeline Force was younger than Astor's own son Vincent. She was barely out of girlhood, while Astor was approaching 50, a middle-aged man with grown children. The marriage was seen as inappropriate, even predatory by some critics. The newspapers covered it extensively, often in disapproving tones. New York society, which had accepted the divorce reluctantly, found the remarriage to such a young woman difficult to countenance. Even in an era when marriages between older wealthy men and much younger women were not uncommon, this particular match seemed to cross some line of propriety. John Jacob Astor was aware of the disapproval and was troubled by it. He was not a man accustomed to being criticized or excluded. His wealth and social position had always protected him from such consequences. But now he found himself somewhat ostracized, receiving fewer invitations to social events, hearing whispered criticisms, seeing disapproval in the eyes of people who had previously treated him with deference. It was uncomfortable, and he decided that perhaps the best response was to leave New York for a time, to allow the scandal to fade, to give society time to adjust to his new marriage. So in the winter of 1911 to 1912, John Jacob and Madeline Astor travelled to Europe and Egypt for an extended honeymoon. They toured the Mediterranean, visited Paris and London, spent time in the warm climate of Egypt to escape the cold northern winter. Madeleine became pregnant during this journey, which was joyful news for the couple, but which also made them anxious to return home. She would need to be in New York for the birth, and as her pregnancy progressed, they decided it was time to head back across the Atlantic. To return to New York, they booked passage on a ship that was making its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York in April of 1912. The ship was the largest and most luxurious vessel ever built, a marvel of modern engineering and design. It was said to be unsinkable, designed with advanced safety features including watertight compartments that could be sealed off if the hull was breached. The ship carried the wealthiest and most prominent passengers. The cream of American and European society were aboard for this historic first voyage. The name of the ship was the RMS Titanic. Let's approach what happened next with care and gentleness, because this is a story of tragedy, of lives lost, of a disaster that would haunt the survivors and capture the imagination of the world for more than a century. The Titanic struck an iceberg late on the night of April 14, 1912 in the North Atlantic, about 400 miles south of Newfoundland. The collision tore a series of openings in the ship's hull, and water began flooding the forward compartments. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable was sinking, and there were not nearly enough lifeboats for all the passengers and crew. John Jacob Astor, awakened by the collision or its aftermath, came up on deck with Madeleine to assess the situation. As understanding spread that the ship was in genuine danger, that evacuation was necessary, the crew began loading lifeboats with women and children first, following the maritime protocol of the time. Madeleine, being 5 months pregnant, was helped into one of the lifeboats. John Jacob asked if he might accompany her, given her condition, but was told that no men would be allowed in the boats while there were still women and children waiting to board. Picture this moment. A man who had never been denied anything in his life, who could buy virtually anything he wanted, who had power and influence and wealth beyond most people's imagination, standing on the deck of a sinking ship and being told he could not save himself. All the money in the world couldn't buy him a place in that lifeboat. All his social position couldn't change the rule that women and children went first. He was subject to the same fate as the poorest passenger in steerage, and his wealth was suddenly, starkly irrelevant. Accounts from survivors suggest that Astor accepted this with calm dignity. He helped his wife into the lifeboat, spoke reassuringly to her, told her he would see her soon, knowing or at least suspecting that this might not be true. He gave his gloves to one of the women boarding the boat, saying she would need them more than he would. He asked a crew member which lifeboat his wife was in, so that if he survived he would know where to find her, and then he stepped back and watched as the boat was lowered to the water, carrying his pregnant young wife away from him and towards safety. The Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15th, about 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking the iceberg. The ship broke apart as it went down, the stern rising high into the air before sliding beneath the surface. More than 1,500 people died in the frigid water, either from drowning or from hypothermia. John Jacob Astor IV was among them. His body was recovered days later by a ship sent to collect the dead. He was identified by the initials on his jacket and by various personal effects, including a gold pocket watch that had stopped at the moment he entered the water. Madeleine Astor survived. Was rescued by the Carpathia along with the other survivors, and arrived in New York to learn that she was a widow. She was 19 years old, pregnant with her first child, and had witnessed one of history's great disasters. The child, a boy named John Jacob Astor VI, was born 4 months later in August of 1912. The boy would inherit a substantial fortune from his father, about $3 million, a smaller share than Vincent Astor received, but still an enormous sum, but would never know the father who died before he was born. The death of John Jacob Astor IV was front-page news around the world. He was the wealthiest person to die on the Titanic, and his death symbolized something larger than one man's loss. It symbolized the vulnerability of even the very wealthy, the limits of what money could accomplish, the ultimate equalizing power of nature and fate. The Gilded Age had been partly about the wealthy displaying their power and immunity from ordinary concerns. The Titanic disaster demonstrated that some forces couldn't be controlled or bought off, that everyone, regardless of wealth, was subject to the same physical reality, the same cold water, the same death. The newspapers covered every detail of the disaster and Astor's role in it. Stories circulated, some true, some embellished, some entirely invented, about his final hours. It was said that he remained calm throughout, that he helped other passengers prepare, that he faced death with courage and dignity. These stories served a purpose, transforming a wealthy man who had been somewhat controversial because of his marriage into a tragic hero. A gentleman who had observed the code of women and children first even when it meant his own death. The scandal of his marriage was forgotten in the larger tragedy. If you're feeling sleepy, let yourself drift with these images. The great ship sinking into the dark Atlantic, the lifeboats rowing away into the night, the cold and the chaos, and then the terrible silence after the ship disappeared. But also, the morning after, the survivors being rescued, Madeleine Astor wrapped in blankets aboard the Carpathia, safe but forever changed. The tragedy settled into history, into memory, into the stories we tell about hubris and fate and the limits of human control. Let these thoughts carry you gently into rest. Astor's will was read and probated, revealing the disposition of his fortune. The bulk of his estate, estimated at between $85 and $150 million, went to his son Vincent Astor, who was 20 at the time of his father's death. Vincent inherited most of the real estate, most of the securities, most of the business interests. Madeleine received the use of a $5 million trust fund for her lifetime, along with various properties, provided she didn't remarry. If she remarried, she would lose the trust fund, though she would keep the properties and various other assets. The unborn child, who would be born as John Jacob Astor VI, was provided for with a substantial trust fund of his own. This structure was typical of wealthy families of the era. The primary fortune stayed in the male line, passing from father to eldest son. Wives and younger children received enough to live comfortably, but not enough to dissipate the principle. The concentration of wealth in a single heir continued the pattern, established by the first John Jacob Astor, maintaining the fortune's integrity across generations. But it also created inequalities within the family that could lead to resentment and conflict. The Astor fortune that Vincent Astor inherited in 1912 was vast, but it existed in a world that was changing in ways that would make the preservation of such concentrated wealth increasingly difficult. The 20th century would bring 2 world wars, a Great Depression, progressive taxation designed specifically to limit dynastic wealth, and social changes that would erode the automatic deference that extreme wealth had once commanded. The story of the Astor fortune in the 20th century is, in many ways, a story of gradual dispersal, of a great concentration of wealth slowly dissipating across generations and circumstances. Vincent Astor was 20 years old when his father died, and he would live until 1959, managing the family fortune for nearly 5 decades. He was, by temperament and circumstance, very different from his great-great-grandfather who had founded the fortune. Where John Jacob Astor had been a builder, an accumulator, a man of relentless ambition and clear vision, Vincent was more of a maintainer, someone managing an inheritance rather than creating something new. This wasn't a character flaw. It was simply a different role, and Vincent understood it as such. Vincent's life was shaped by his wealth in ways both enabling and constraining. He could pursue any interest that captured his attention, fund any project, travel anywhere, live in the finest homes, associate with the most interesting and accomplished people of his era. But he was also trapped by expectations, by the responsibility of managing properties that thousands of people depended on for housing and employment. by the demands of maintaining social position, by the knowledge that whatever he accomplished would always be seen through the lens of his inherited wealth rather than his own merits. He tried various pursuits. He was interested in yachting and owned several yachts throughout his life, including one called the Nur Mahal that was essentially a small ship, equipped for extended ocean voyages. He supported scientific research, funding expeditions and studies, particularly in marine biology. He dabbled in publishing, acquiring magazines and newspapers. He involved himself in New York civic affairs, serving on various boards and committees. He was, in short, a wealthy dilettante in the original sense of the word, someone who pursued interests for their own sake rather than for money, because money was never an object of concern. But the real work of his life was managing the Astor real estate holdings, and this work was becoming increasingly complex and challenging. The simple model that the first John Jacob Astor had established, buy land, lease it on ground leases, collect rent, hold forever, was running into practical and legal difficulties. Some of the 99-year leases that had been granted in the early 1800s were beginning to expire or had expired, and the terms needed to be renegotiated. Tenants who had built substantial buildings on Astor land were not eager to simply hand over those buildings when leases expired. Legal disputes multiplied. The costs of managing the properties, legal fees, taxes, administrative overhead, were increasing. More fundamentally, the tax environment was changing in ways that made it much harder to preserve concentrated wealth across generations. The federal estate tax had been introduced in 1916, initially as a wartime measure but quickly becoming permanent. The rate started relatively low but increased steadily over the following decades. By mid-century, the top estate tax rate would reach 77% on the largest estates. This meant that when wealth passed from one generation to the next, more than 3/4 of it could be taken by the government unless careful estate planning was undertaken. The income tax, which had been reintroduced in 1913 after being declared constitutional via the 16th Amendment, also imposed substantial costs on the very wealthy. Vincent Astor's rental income was taxed at increasingly high rates as the progressive income tax was implemented and expanded. By the 1930s and 40s, the top marginal income tax rate exceeded 90%. While various deductions and strategies could reduce the effective rate, the basic reality was that government was taking a much larger share of income and wealth than it ever had before. Let yourself consider what this meant for dynastic wealth. The Astors, like other wealthy families, had to adapt to a new reality where simply holding assets and collecting income was no longer sufficient to maintain wealth across generations. Estate planning became crucial. Trusts, foundations, strategic gifting, various legal structures designed to minimize tax liability while still providing for heirs. The work of managing wealth became as much about tax law as about real estate management. The Great Depression of the 1930s affected the Astor fortune less severely than it affected many other families, largely because real estate in Manhattan remained valuable even during the economic collapse. People still needed places to live and work, even if they struggled to pay rent. Some properties became less profitable as tenants defaulted or negotiated reduced rents, but the fundamental value of owning land in the nation's largest city remained. The Astors weathered the Depression in relative comfort, though even they felt some impact from the economic devastation that surrounded them. Vincent's involvement in civic affairs increased during the Depression years. He participated in various relief efforts, donated money to charitable causes, and tried to be a responsible, wealthy citizen. But he also maintained the lifestyle expected of someone of his position: large homes, servants, yachts, extensive travel. The contrast between his life and the lives of ordinary people struggling through the Depression was stark, and it contributed to growing public skepticism about inherited wealth and the wealthy class generally. During World War II, Vincent served in various military and civilian roles, using his organizational abilities and connections to support the war effort. This was partly patriotism and partly a recognition that the wealthy needed to demonstrate their commitment to the nation during wartime or face even greater public hostility. The war years saw the highest income tax rates in American history, with top marginal rates exceeding 90%, ostensibly to finance the war, but also reflecting a political environment that was increasingly willing to use taxation to limit wealth concentration. After the war, Vincent continued managing the Astor properties, but also became increasingly focused on philanthropy. He established the Vincent Astor Foundation with substantial funding, creating an institution that would outlive him and continue supporting charitable causes. This was partly genuine altruism. Vincent seemed to believe that great wealth carried obligations, but it was also practical estate planning. Money given to a charitable foundation avoided estate taxes and could be used to benefit society, while also preserving the Astor name and influence in a different form. The question of succession troubled Vincent throughout his adult life. He married 3 times, but had no children. His first marriage, to Helen Dinsmore Huntington, ended in divorce after 5 years. His second marriage, to Mary Benedict Cushing, lasted longer, but also ended in divorce. His third marriage, to Brooke Russell Marshall, was happy by most accounts, but also childless. Without direct heirs, Vincent had to think carefully about what would happen to the fortune after his death. He could leave it to more distant relatives. But he had no particularly close relationships with cousins or other family members who might be in line to inherit. Or he could convert the wealth into institutional form through foundations and trusts that would serve public purposes while preserving the Astor name. Meanwhile, other branches of the Astor family were pursuing their own paths. The British Astors, descended from William Walldorf Astor, who had moved to England in the 1890s, had become fully integrated into British society. Nancy Astor, who married into the family, became the first woman to sit in the British House of Commons in 1919, a historic achievement. The British Astors were active in politics, society and public affairs, maintaining wealth and prominence, but in a very different context from their American relatives. The American Astor real estate holdings were slowly being sold off through the mid-20th century. The model of holding property forever was becoming less viable. Some properties were sold to pay estate taxes when family members died. Others were sold because they were simply difficult to manage profitably, given the increased complexity of property law and tenant rights. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, in its original location at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street, was sold in 1929, demolished, and replaced by the Empire State Building, with the Waldorf Astoria name moving to a new location on Park Avenue. This was symbolic. Even the most famous Astor properties were not sacred, not immune to the commercial logic of highest and best use. By the 1950s, Vincent was in his 60s and beginning to think seriously about his legacy. The Vincent Astor Foundation had been established. But what about the real estate empire itself? What about the family name and its future? He had spent decades managing properties, collecting rents, dealing with the endless details of a large real estate portfolio, but for what ultimate purpose? To pass to distant relatives who might squander it, to be taxed away by the government, to simply continue accumulating forever with no clear endpoint. Vincent died in 1959 at the age of 67. His will was carefully structured to minimize estate taxes while still providing for his widow Brooke and making substantial bequests to the Vincent Astor Foundation. The bulk of his fortune, estimated at perhaps $100 million at his death, though exact figures are difficult to determine, was converted into the Foundation's endowment. Brooke received the income from a trust during her lifetime, along with various properties and personal effects, but the principal would eventually go to the Foundation as well. The Astor fortune, at least Vincent's portion of it, was being transformed from family wealth into institutional philanthropy. Other family members inherited smaller portions of the dispersed Astor wealth. John Jacob Astor VI, Vincent's half-brother who had been born after their father died on the Titanic, inherited a substantial but not overwhelming fortune. various cousins and more distant relatives received bequests. But the concentration of wealth that had existed in earlier generations was gone. The Astor fortune had been divided, taxed, donated, transformed. It still existed in various forms, but it was no longer the unified, dominating force it had been at its peak. The Vincent Astor Foundation would continue operating for decades, giving away millions of dollars to various causes: education, healthcare, cultural institutions, social services. Brooke Astor, Vincent's widow, became famous in her own right for her philanthropy and her role in New York civic life. She lived until 2007, reaching the age of 105, and spent her later decades giving away the Astor fortune to worthy causes throughout New York City. She became, in a way, the most beloved Astor since the founder, known not for accumulating wealth, but for distributing it thoughtfully and effectively. Picture Brooke Astor in her later years, a small, elegant woman in her 80s and 90s, still active, still engaged, attending charity events and fundraisers, writing checks to support libraries and museums and social service organizations. She represented a different model of wealth, not accumulation or preservation, but strategic disposal, using money to improve the city and society. The Astor name, which had once been associated with accumulation and sometimes with ruthlessness, became associated with generosity and civic responsibility. This was a form of redemption, a way of justifying the fortune's existence by putting it to public use. The comparison between the Astor fortune and other American fortunes of similar vintage is instructive. The Rockefeller family, for instance, managed to preserve their wealth more successfully across generations through careful estate planning, diversification, and the creation of family offices and trusts. The Rockefellers remained wealthy into the 21st century, with multiple generations maintaining significant wealth and influence. The DuPont family similarly preserved wealth through corporate ownership and careful management. But the Astors, who had once been as wealthy as any of these families, saw their fortune largely dispersed by the late 20th century. Why did the Astor fortune disperse more completely than some others? Several factors seem relevant. The Astor wealth was heavily concentrated in Manhattan real estate, which was valuable but also illiquid and difficult to manage across generations. The family had fewer children on average than some other wealthy dynasties, meaning there were fewer heirs to carry on the name and fortune. The tax environment of the 20th century, particularly the high estate tax rates from the 1940s through the 1970s, made it difficult to pass wealth intact from generation to generation without sophisticated planning. And perhaps most importantly, successive generations of Astors seemed less interested in wealth accumulation for its own sake, more willing to convert wealth into other forms, philanthropy, lifestyle, public service, rather than simply maximizing the fortune's size. Madeline Astor would remarry in 1916 to a childhood friend, which meant she forfeited her trust fund from John Jacob Astor's estate, as the will had specified. She lived until 1940, raising her son and living comfortably on what she'd retained. Her second marriage ended in divorce, and she married a third time. Her life after the Titanic was long, but was forever defined by that event, by those hours on a sinking ship and the death of her husband. The Astor fortune continued, managed now by Vincent and by professional trustees and lawyers who had experience with the family's holdings. The real estate remained valuable, Manhattan continued to grow, rents continued to be collected. But the family's dominance of New York society was waning. Other families had risen, new fortunes had been made, the social hierarchies that Caroline Astor had enforced were breaking down. The Astors remained wealthy and prominent, but they were no longer quite as central to the city's life as they had been. The Titanic took more than John Jacob Astor's life. It took a particular vision of how the world worked, a confidence that wealth and technology and progress had eliminated the old dangers and uncertainties. The ship was supposed to represent the triumph of human engineering, the conquest of nature, the ability of modern civilization to create safety and luxury even in the middle of the ocean. Instead, it demonstrated the opposite, that nature was still more powerful than human creations, that disasters could still strike regardless of how carefully we planned, that death came for rich and poor alike even if the rich died in first-class cabins and the poor in steerage. The story of the Titanic would be told and retold for more than a century, in books and films and endless retellings. John Jacob Astor's role in it, the wealthy man who followed the code, who gave up his seat for women and children, who died with dignity, became part of the mythology. Whether the real man matched this heroic image is perhaps less important than what the image represented. A moment when wealth didn't matter, when character was tested, when someone passed the test. In death, John Jacob Astor IV achieved a kind of redemption for the scandal of his marriage and a lasting fame that went beyond simply being rich. As we move past this tragedy toward understanding what happened to the Astor fortune in the decades that followed, let the image of the Titanic rest gently. The ship is gone, lying on the ocean floor miles beneath the surface. The people who died are gone, more than a century now since they drew their last breaths in cold water. But the memory persists, the story endures, and John Jacob Astor's death aboard that ship remains one of the most famous moments in the family's long history. From a butcher's son arriving in America with 7 flutes to a colonel dying aboard the Titanic with grace and courage, the arc of the family had been remarkable, and the arc was not yet complete. There's something almost philosophically interesting about this dispersal. The first John Jacob Astor had spent his entire life accumulating wealth, sacrificing comfort and relationships and ease to build a fortune. His immediate successors had worked to preserve it, understanding their role as stewards for future generations. But eventually the descendants asked a fundamental question. What's the point of just preserving wealth forever? What purpose does it serve to have hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in trusts and real estate, generating income that far exceeds what any family could spend, benefiting no one except accountants and lawyers and distant heirs? The Astor fortune that Vincent Astor inherited in 1912 was vast. But it existed in a world that was changing in ways that would make the preservation of such concentrated wealth increasingly difficult. The 20th century would bring 2 world wars, a Great Depression, progressive taxation designed specifically to limit dynastic wealth, and social changes that would erode the automatic deference that extreme wealth had once commanded. The story of the Astor fortune in the 20th century is, in many ways, a story of gradual dispersal, of a great concentration of wealth slowly dissipating across generations and circumstances. Vincent Astor was 20 years old when his father died, and he would live until 1959, managing the family fortune for nearly 5 decades. He was, by temperament and circumstance, very different from his great-great-grandfather, who had founded the fortune. Where John Jacob Astor had been a builder, an accumulator, a man of relentless ambition and clear vision, Vincent was more of a maintainer, someone managing an inheritance rather than creating something new. This wasn't a character flaw, it was simply a different role, and Vincent understood it as such. Vincent's life was shaped by his wealth in ways both enabling and constraining. He could pursue any interest that captured his attention, fund any project, travel anywhere, live in the finest homes, associate with the most interesting and accomplished people of his era. But he was also trapped by expectations, by the responsibility of managing properties that thousands of people depended on for housing and employment, by the demands of maintaining social position, by the knowledge that whatever he accomplished would always be seen through the lens of his inherited wealth, rather than his own merits. He tried various pursuits. He was interested in yachting and owned several yachts throughout his life, including one called the Noormahal that was essentially a small ship, equipped for extended ocean voyages. He supported scientific research, funding expeditions and studies, particularly in marine biology. He dabbled in publishing, acquiring magazines and newspapers, He involved himself in New York civic affairs, serving on various boards and committees. He was, in short, a wealthy dilettante in the original sense of the word, someone who pursued interests for their own sake rather than for money, because money was never an object of concern, but the real work of his life was managing the Astor real estate holdings. And this work was becoming increasingly complex and challenging. The simple model that the first John Jacob Astor had established, buy land, lease it on ground leases, collect rent, hold forever, was running into practical and legal difficulties. Some of the 99-year leases that had been granted in the early 1800s were beginning to expire or had expired, and the terms needed to be renegotiated. Tenants who had built substantial buildings on Astor land were not eager to simply hand over those buildings when leases expired. Legal disputes multiplied. The costs of managing the properties, legal fees, taxes, administrative overhead, were increasing. More fundamentally, the tax environment was changing in ways that made it much harder to preserve concentrated wealth across generations. The federal estate tax had been introduced in 1916, initially as a wartime measure but quickly becoming permanent. The rate started relatively low but increased steadily over the following decades. By mid-century, the top estate tax rate would reach 77% on the largest estates. This meant that when wealth passed from one generation to the next, more than 3/4 of it could be taken by the government unless careful estate planning was undertaken. The income tax, which had been reintroduced in 1913 after being declared constitutional via the 16th Amendment, also imposed substantial costs on the very wealthy. Vincent Astor's rental income was taxed at increasingly high rates, as the progressive income tax was implemented and expanded. By the 1930s and 40s, the top marginal income tax rate exceeded 90%. While various deductions and strategies could reduce the effective rate, the basic reality was that government was taking a much larger share of income and wealth than it ever had before. Let yourself consider what this meant for dynastic wealth. The Astors, like other wealthy families, had to adapt to a new reality where simply holding assets and collecting income was no longer sufficient to maintain wealth across generations. Estate planning became crucial. Trusts, foundations, strategic gifting, various legal structures designed to minimize tax liability while still providing for heirs. The work of managing wealth became as much about tax law as about real estate management. The answer that Vincent and Brooke Astor arrived at was that wealth should ultimately serve some public purpose. If you couldn't take it with you, if it would just be taxed away or fought over by heirs, why not use it intentionally and strategically to benefit society? This was a different philosophy from the founders' philosophy, but it was perhaps a more mature one, a recognition that wealth is ultimately ephemeral, that what matters is what you do with it during the brief time it's under your control. By the end of the 20th century, the Astor name remained well known, but more for historical reasons than for contemporary wealth or power. There were still Astors, both in America and in Britain, and some of them remained wealthy by ordinary standards. But none approached the dominant position that the family had held in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The fortune that had once been among the largest in America had been distributed, donated, taxed, divided, and transformed. The great concentration of wealth had returned to the society from which it had been extracted. If you're feeling drowsy, let the long arc of the Astor fortune rest in your mind. From accumulation through preservation to eventual dispersal, from one man's hunger to build wealth to multiple generations' management, to eventual conversion into philanthropy. The cycle completed itself over more than a century and a half, the fortune rising and then slowly settling back, like a wave that builds and then spreads across the beach. Let that gentle image carry you towards sleep. The real estate that the Astors had once owned continued to exist, of course. The land didn't disappear, land never does. It simply passed to other owners, to new investors and developers, to corporations and institutions. Buildings were demolished and replaced. neighbourhoods transformed, the city continued its endless evolution. But the Astor imprint remained in street names, in institutions that bore their name, in the historic buildings they had constructed or commissioned, in the memory of what they had represented during their period of dominance. The story of the Astor fortune's dispersal is not unique, but it is instructive. It demonstrates that even the greatest fortunes are not permanent, that wealth is dynamic rather than static, that each generation must make choices about how to use and dispose of what they've inherited. The Astors chose, ultimately, to convert their wealth from private property into public benefit, to let the fortune disperse rather than fighting to preserve it at all costs. Whether this was wisdom or failure depends on one's perspective, but it was a choice, consciously made, and it changed the family's legacy from one of pure accumulation to one of eventual generosity. The 20th century had not been kind to the model of dynastic wealth that the first John Jacob Astor had established. Taxation, social change, the costs of maintaining large property portfolios, the difficulty of finding heirs who were both capable and interested in managing a real estate empire, all of these factors worked against preservation. The Astors adapted as best they could, but ultimately the tide was too strong to resist. The fortune dispersed, and with it dispersed a particular vision of family legacy, an inherited privilege that had seemed so permanent during the Gilded Age. Vincent Astor, suddenly one of the wealthiest men in America at age 20, was thrust into responsibilities he might not have been entirely ready for. He had been educated at Harvard, but hadn't completed his degree. He had been preparing to eventually inherit, certainly, but had expected to have more time, to learn gradually under his father's guidance. Instead, he was orphaned. His parents had divorced, his father was dead, and was now managing a vast real estate empire and dealing with family complexities, including his father's young widow and infant half-brother. The Titanic disaster marked a symbolic end to the era that the Astors had helped define. The Gilded Age, with its certainties and hierarchies and displays of wealth, was giving way to the 20th century with its wars and social upheavals and challenges to established orders. The sinking of the unsinkable ship, taking with it some of the wealthiest and most prominent people of the era, felt like a metaphor for the vulnerability of the entire system. The world that John Jacob Astor had left when he boarded the Titanic was not quite the same world that the survivors returned to. Madeline Astor would remarry in 1916 to a childhood friend, which meant she forfeited her trust fund from John Jacob Astor's estate, as the will had specified. She lived until 1940, raising her son and living comfortably on what she had retained. Her second marriage ended in divorce, and she married a third time. Her life after the Titanic was long, but was forever defined by that event, by those hours on a sinking ship and the death of her husband. The Astor fortune continued, managed now by Vincent and by professional trustees and lawyers who had experience with the family's holdings. The real estate remained valuable, Manhattan continued to grow, rents continued to be collected. But the family's dominance of New York society was waning. Other families had risen, new fortunes had been made, the social hierarchies that Caroline Astor had enforced were breaking down. The Astors remained wealthy and prominent, but they were no longer quite as central to the city's life as they had been. The Titanic took more than John Jacob Astor's life. It took a particular vision of how the world worked, a confidence that wealth and technology and progress had eliminated the old dangers and uncertainties. The ship was supposed to represent the triumph of human engineering, the conquest of nature, the ability of modern civilization to create safety and luxury even in the middle of the ocean. Instead, it demonstrated the opposite, that nature was still more powerful than human creations, that disasters could still strike regardless of how carefully we planned, that death came for rich and poor alike even if the rich died in first-class cabins and the poor in steerage. The story of the Titanic would be told and retold for more than a century, in books and films and endless retellings. John Jacob Astor's role in it, the wealthy man who followed the code, who gave up his seat for women and children, who died with dignity, became part of the mythology. Whether the real man matched this heroic image is perhaps less important than what the image represented. A moment when wealth didn't matter, when character was tested, when someone passed the test. In death, John Jacob Astor IV achieved a kind of redemption for the scandal of his marriage and a lasting fame that went beyond simply being rich. As we move past this tragedy toward understanding what happened to the Astor fortune in the decades that followed, let the image of the Titanic rest gently. The ship is gone, lying on the ocean floor miles beneath the surface. The people who died are gone, more than a century now since they drew their last breaths in cold water. But the memory persists, the story endures, and John Jacob Astor's death aboard that ship remains one of the most famous moments in the family's long history. From a butcher's son arriving in America with 7 flutes to a colonel dying aboard the Titanic with grace and courage, the arc of the family had been remarkable, and the arc was not yet complete. And so we've travelled together through more than 2 centuries, from a small village in Germany to the heights of American wealth, from a young immigrant with 7 flutes to a family whose name defined an era. We've watched wealth accumulate through patience and strategy, witnessed its transformation into social power, and seen its eventual dispersal back into the world. The arc is almost poetic in its completeness, the rise and the gradual settling, the hunger to build and the wisdom to let go. What does any of this mean for you, wherever you are right now, in whatever circumstances you find yourself? Perhaps simply this, that all fortunes, all dynasties, all seemingly permanent structures are temporary. That what matters isn't how much we accumulate, but what we do with what we have, however modest or grand. That legacy takes many forms, not just wealth passed to children, but contributions to the world, kindness given freely, work done well. The Astors built something remarkable, yes, but in the end they're remembered as much for what they gave away as for what they accumulated. Let the story of the Astors drift away now, like a ship sailing into morning fog, slowly disappearing until only the impression remains. Let your breathing slow, your body sink deeper into rest. Whatever wealth or worries occupy your waking hours, they can wait. For now, there's only this moment, this breath, this gentle slide into sleep. The past is settled. The future will take care of itself. Right now, you need only rest. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and let yourself go completely into the quiet dark. Good night.